Welcome to the most comprehensive deep dive into the world of Family Guy you'll ever experience. Before we begin this journey through the twisted history of the Griffin family and everyone in their orbit, make sure you're subscribed to the channel. We've got hours of content ahead, so get comfortable, relax, and let's explore every corner of this animated universe that's been making us laugh and gasp in equal measure for over 2 decades. Family Guy premiered on January 31st, 1999, and immediately established itself as something different in the landscape of animated sitcoms. Created by Seth MacFarlane, who was just 24 years old when he pitched the show to Fox, Family Guy brought a new kind of humor to television. One that wasn't afraid to push boundaries, make cultural references at lightning speed, and build a world where literally anything could happen. What started as a relatively straightforward sitcom about a dysfunctional family in Rhode Island has evolved into a cultural phenomenon that's spawned over 400 episodes, multiple movies, countless memes, and a legacy that's influenced an entire generation of comedy writers. But tonight, we're not just talking about the show itself. We're diving deep into the lore, the backstories, the connections between characters that span decades, sometimes centuries. We're exploring how a working-class family in a fictional Rhode Island town became the center of one of television's longest-running and most controversial animated series. We're going to trace bloodlines, uncover hidden histories, and examine how every character, from the main cast to the most obscure background players, fits into the larger tapestry of Quahog, Rhode Island. The Griffin family didn't just appear in Quahog out of nowhere. Like any family, they have roots that stretch back through generations, connecting them to different parts of the world, different eras of history, and different social classes. Understanding where the Griffins came from helps us understand why they are the way they are today. It explains Peter's particular brand of ignorant confidence, Lois's complex relationship with wealth and privilege, and why this particular family ended up in this particular place at this particular time. Let's start with the patriarch of the family, Peter Griffin, and trace his lineage backward through time. Peter's ancestry is far more complicated than he ever understood for most of his life. For years, Peter believed he was the son of Francis Griffin, a strict, authoritarian Irish Catholic man who never missed an opportunity to criticize his son or make him feel inadequate. Francis Griffin was a towerman at a mill, a working-class job that he took seriously and used as a benchmark for what a real man should be. He was the kind of father who believed in tough love, except without much of the love part. Francis was harsh, judgmental, and seemed to take particular pleasure in pointing out Peter's many failings. Peter's mother, Thelma Griffin, was a warm Irish woman who provided whatever emotional support she could in a household dominated by Francis's rigid worldview. She was Catholic, deeply religious, and tried to raise Peter within the framework of the church. Thelma was the softer presence in Peter's childhood, though even she couldn't completely shield him from Francis's harsh parenting style. The Griffin household was one of modest means, strict rules, and the constant presence of Catholic guilt that would follow Peter throughout his life, even as he repeatedly failed to live up to the church's teachings. But here's where Peter's story takes its first major turn. Peter wasn't actually Francis Griffin's biological son. This revelation came much later in Peter's life, but it explains so much about the dynamic between father and son. Francis had always known that Peter wasn't his biological child, which is why he treated Peter with such particular cruelty. Every time Francis looked at Peter, he saw the evidence of his wife's infidelity, a living reminder of a betrayal he chose to live with rather than abandon. Peter's real father was Mickey McFinnigan, an Irish immigrant who had a brief affair with Thelma Griffin. Mickey was everything Francis wasn't. He was fun-loving, carefree, worked at a brewery, and lived life without the weight of responsibility or Catholic guilt holding him down. When Peter eventually discovered the truth about his parentage, it was like a key unlocking aspects of his personality that had never made sense before. His love of beer, his childlike enthusiasm, his inability to take life seriously. These weren't just personality quirks. They were inherited traits from a biological father he'd never known. The revelation about Mickey McFinnigan didn't just affect Peter. It recontextualized his entire childhood. Every harsh word from Francis, every disappointed look, every comparison to what a son should be, suddenly made sense in a darker way. Francis hadn't been trying to toughen up his son. He'd been punishing a child for the sin of existing as evidence of his wife's betrayal. This explains the deep-seated need for approval that drives so much of Peter's adult behavior. It explains why he constantly seeks validation from his friends, why he creates elaborate schemes to prove himself, and why he sometimes acts out in ways that seem designed to get attention, even negative attention. Peter's early life in Providence, Rhode Island, was marked by this tension between who Francis wanted him to be and who Peter actually was. He attended Catholic school, where he was an unremarkable student at best. He wasn't particularly athletic, wasn't academically inclined, and didn't show any special talents that might have earned Francis's approval. What Peter did have was an active imagination and a desperate need to be liked. These traits would follow him into adulthood, where they'd become both his greatest strengths and his most significant weaknesses. Now let's turn to the other side of the family tree, because Lois's background couldn't be more different from Peter's if it tried. Lois Pewterschmidt was born into one of the wealthiest families in Rhode Island, possibly in all of New England. The Pewterschmidt fortune was built over generations through shipping, manufacturing, and the kind of ruthless business practices that defined American capitalism in the 19th and early 20th centuries. By the time Lois was born, the Pewterschmidt name meant something. It opened doors, commanded respect, and came with expectations about how a young woman of her social standing should behave. Carter Pewterschmidt, Lois's father, was and still is a titan of industry. He's the kind of old money aristocrat who believes wealth equals worth, and that being born into privilege is evidence of inherent superiority. Carter built on the family fortune through shrewd business dealings, hostile takeovers, and a complete lack of concern for the human cost of his decisions. He's donated to every presidential campaign, Republican and Democrat alike, because he understands that real power means having influence regardless of who's in office. He owns newspapers, television stations, and has his fingers in more industries than even he probably remembers. Barbara Pewterschmidt, Lois's mother, was the perfect society wife for a man like Carter. She came from old money herself, understood the social games that needed to be played, and raised her children according to the strict rules of their social class. Barbara was all about appearances, proper behavior, and maintaining the family's reputation. She hosted charity galas, sat on the boards of museums, and made sure her children understood that they represented something larger than themselves. They were Pewterschmidts, and that meant something. Lois grew up in the Pewterschmidt mansion in Newport, Rhode Island, a sprawling estate that looked like something out of a Gilded Age novel. She had everything money could buy: private tutors, piano lessons, riding lessons, summers in Europe, winters skiing in Aspen. She attended the finest private schools where she was expected to socialize with other children of privilege, eventually marry someone from an approved family, and continue the Pewterschmidt legacy in the appropriate manner. But Lois was never quite the daughter Carter wanted her to be. From a young age, she showed signs of rebellion against the constraints of her upbringing. She was creative, passionate, and drawn to experiences that had nothing to do with her family's money or status. As a teenager, Lois discovered music and quickly developed real talent as a pianist. But it wasn't classical music that captured her imagination. It was rock and roll, jazz, the kind of music that her parents considered vulgar and beneath someone of her breeding. Lois also had an adventurous streak that would repeatedly get her into trouble throughout her youth. She wasn't content to simply attend cotillions and gardens parties. She wanted to experience life beyond the bubble of wealth that surrounded her. This led to a series of teenage rebellions that horrified her parents. She snuck out to concerts, spent time with people from different social classes, and generally refused to accept that her life had already been mapped out for her by accident of birth. The Pewterschmidt family also included Lois's brother, Patrick, though his story is complicated in ways that reveal the darker side of privilege. Patrick had everything Lois had in terms of opportunities and resources, but he became someone very different. Where Lois used her privilege as a launching pad for independence, Patrick embraced the worst aspects of their family's worldview. But we'll get more into Patrick's story later. So how did these two families, the working-class Catholic Griffins and the aristocratic Protestant Pewterschmidts, come together? How did a woman born into one of Rhode Island's wealthiest families end up married to a man who would eventually work at a toy factory? The answer involves rebellion, genuine love, and the kind of choices that permanently alter the trajectory of a life. Peter and Lois met in the 1980s, and their meeting was not the result of any social gathering or approved introduction. Peter wasn't moving in circles where he'd naturally encounter Pewterschmidt heiresses. He was working class, living in a small apartment, and his biggest ambitions at the time involved drinking beer with his friends, and maybe, possibly, figuring out what he wanted to do with his life. He'd had a series of unremarkable jobs, nothing that suggested he was going anywhere in particular. Lois, meanwhile, was in her own period of rebellion. She'd rejected the life her parents wanted for her and was actively seeking something real, something authentic, something that wasn't about money or status or family names. She was working as a stewardess, a job that her parents considered embarrassingly beneath her station, but which gave her the freedom and adventure she craved. She'd also had a brief career as a model, another choice that horrified Carter and Barbara, who felt that their daughter shouldn't be putting herself on display like common goods. When Peter and Lois's paths crossed, it was instant attraction built on things that had nothing to do with compatibility on paper. Peter was funny, genuine, and completely unpretentious. He had no idea who the Pewterschmidts were, which meant he treated Lois like a normal person rather than an heiress. For Lois, this was incredibly refreshing. She'd spent her entire life around people who wanted something from her family, who calculated every interaction based on social advantage or financial gain. Peter just liked her. He thought she was beautiful, laughed at his jokes, and seemed interested in him for who he was. For Peter, Lois represented something he'd never experienced before. She was educated, cultured, could play piano like a professional, and carried herself with a confidence he'd never possessed. But she also saw something in him that Frances Griffin never had. She didn't think Peter was a disappointment or a failure. She found his childlike enthusiasm charming rather than pathetic. She laughed with him rather than at him. Their courtship was fast and intense, the kind of romance that happens when two people from completely different worlds find unexpected connection. But it wasn't without complications. When Lois brought Peter home to meet her parents, the meeting went about as well as you'd expect. Carter took one look at Peter and saw everything he despised. Lack of ambition, working class manners, no social standing, no prospects. In Carter's worldview, Peter was exactly the kind of person Lois should avoid. Someone who would drag down the family name and waste the opportunities that came with being a Pewterschmidt. Barbara was more subtle in her disapproval, but it was there nonetheless. She couldn't understand what her accomplished, educated daughter saw in this man who seemed to have no particular talents or direction. The Pewterschmidts made their opposition clear. If Lois married Peter, she would be cut off from the family fortune. She would lose access to the trust funds, the social connections, the safety net that came with being a Pewterschmidt. It was meant to be an ultimatum that would force Lois to come to her senses. But Lois chose Peter. She chose him, knowing exactly what she was giving up. She chose love over money, authenticity over status, and freedom over security. This choice defined her life in ways she probably couldn't have fully understood at the time. It meant that instead of living in a Newport mansion, she'd live in a modest house in Quahog. Instead of having servants, she'd do her own housework. Instead of leisure and travel, she'd be stretching a limited budget and worrying about bills. Yet Lois never seemed to truly regret the choice, even as the realities of life with Peter became clear. She married Peter Griffin and became Lois Griffin, trading one identity for another. The Pewterschmidts eventually came back around, because family ties among the wealthy are hard to break completely, but the relationship was forever changed. Carter would spend decades insulting Peter, undermining him, and making clear his belief that Lois had married beneath herself. Peter and Lois settled in Quahog, Rhode Island, a small working-class town that would become the center of their universe. Quahog was chosen partly for practical reasons. It was affordable, had jobs available, and was close enough to Providence and Newport that they weren't completely isolated. But it also represented a middle ground between Peter's working-class roots and Lois's privileged background. Quahog was neither the tough Providence neighborhoods where Peter grew up, nor the mansions of Newport where Lois was raised. It was somewhere in between, a place where they could build their own life together. The Griffin family name would take root in Quahog, becoming synonymous with the town itself over the next several decades. Peter and Lois would have 3 children in that house on Spooner Street, each one inheriting different aspects of both family lineages. They would build friendships that would last for decades, get involved in countless town events and controversies, and become central figures in the community, despite, or perhaps because of, their constant chaos. Understanding the Griffin family origins helps explain so much about what comes later. Peter's deep-seated insecurity and need for approval stems from Frances Griffin's rejection and the complicated legacy of Mickey McFinnigan. Lois's constant struggle to maintain control and respectability, despite her husband's antics, connects directly to her rebellious choice to leave privilege behind. The tension between working-class values and aristocratic expectations plays out in the Griffin household every single day. The Griffin family tree continues to branch in unexpected ways, as we'll discover. There are relatives we haven't even mentioned yet, connections to Irish heritage and WASP aristocracy that will become important. There are secrets buried in both family lines, skeletons in closets that will emerge at the most inconvenient times. The Griffins are messy, complicated, and thoroughly American in their mixture of different class backgrounds, ethnic identities, and regional influences. As we move forward through this comprehensive exploration of Family Guy lore, keep these origins in mind. Every character decision, every family dynamic, every conflict and reconciliation traces back to these roots. Peter's working-class Catholic background, clashing with Lois's upper-class Protestant upbringing, creates the fundamental tension that drives much of the show's comedy and drama. Their children inherit this tension, each processing it differently and developing their own relationships with both sides of the family. The story of how the Griffins came to be in Quahog is really the story of American social mobility, class conflict, and the ways that love can bridge seemingly unbridgeable divides. It's about rebellion and conformity, about choosing your own path versus following the one laid out for you. It's about family in all its complicated, messy, frustrating, and ultimately redeeming glory. Now that we understand where the Griffin family came from and how they ended up in Quahog, we can dive deep into each family member's individual story. We'll explore how Peter went from a confused young man seeking his father's approval to the patriarch of his own chaotic household. We'll discover the layers behind Lois's seemingly patient exterior and understand what drives her to stay with Peter, despite everything. We'll meet their children and understand how growing up Griffin shaped each of them in profound ways. The foundation is laid. The family tree has been mapped. Now, it's time to explore every branch, every leaf, every hidden root system that makes the Griffin family what it is. This is the complete story of Family Guy, told from the beginning, with every detail, every connection, and every piece of backstory that makes this animated universe so rich and endlessly fascinating. Peter Griffin is a man of contradictions. He's simultaneously the dumbest and luckiest person in Quahog. He's caused countless disasters, yet somehow maintained steady employment for decades. He's deeply insecure, yet possesses unshakable confidence. He's a terrible father who nevertheless loves his family in his own deeply flawed way. Understanding Peter means understanding how a person can be all these things at once, and that journey starts with a birth that Peter himself didn't fully understand for most of his life. Peter Griffin was born in Mexico. Yes, Mexico. This detail often surprises people because Peter is so thoroughly associated with Rhode Island and Irish Catholic culture, but his birth took place south of the border under circumstances that were deeply embarrassing to the Griffin family. Thelma Griffin was pregnant, and Frances Griffin, whether he knew the child wasn't his or suspected it, decided that the child should be born far away from their Providence community. Perhaps he thought distance would make the situation less real, or maybe he simply couldn't stand the idea of facing their neighbors while Thelma gave birth to another man's child. The exact circumstances of Peter's Mexican birth remain somewhat mysterious. The Griffin family doesn't talk about it much, and when it does come up, it's treated as an embarrassing family secret rather than an interesting cultural connection. Peter holds dual citizenship as a result, something that becomes relevant in later storylines. But for most of his childhood, The Mexican birth was just a strange footnote in his personal history, not something that shaped his identity in any meaningful way. Peter was raised in Providence, Rhode Island, in a working-class Irish Catholic neighborhood where Francis Griffin's word was law. The Griffin household was not a happy one. Francis was stern, judgmental, and seemed to take personal offense at nearly everything Peter did. He criticized Peter's weight, his intelligence, his lack of athletic ability, his friends, his interests, and his very existence. Looking back, knowing that Francis knew Peter wasn't his biological son, these criticisms take on a darker tone. Francis was punishing Peter for existing, for being a daily reminder of Thelma's infidelity. Thelma tried to provide some warmth and comfort, but she was limited by her own guilt and her subservience to Francis's authority. She loved Peter, that much was clear, but she couldn't protect him from Francis's cruelty. She couldn't explain why his father treated him differently than he might treat a biological son, because that would mean revealing the truth about Peter's parentage. And she wasn't ready to detonate that particular bomb in the middle of their already tense household. Growing up, Peter attended Catholic school, where he was an indifferent student at best. He wasn't stupid exactly, but he had no interest in academics. He couldn't focus on lessons when there were so many more interesting things to think about. He had an active imagination, dreaming up elaborate scenarios and adventures that had nothing to do with math or English or church history. His teachers found him frustrating because he clearly wasn't trying, and his classmates found him easy to ignore because he wasn't particularly cool, athletic, or funny enough to stand out. Peter's childhood friendships were limited. He wasn't the kind of kid who easily made friends or impressed others. He was overweight, awkward, and desperate for approval in ways that made other kids uncomfortable. The friendships he did form tended to be with other outsiders, other kids who didn't quite fit in with the popular crowd. These early experiences of rejection and isolation would shape Peter's adult, desperate need to be liked, to be part of a group, to have friends who actually wanted him around. One of the defining aspects of Peter's childhood was his relationship with the Catholic Church. Francis insisted on strict religious observance, dragging Peter to Mass every Sunday and making him attend religious education classes. Peter went through all the expected rituals: baptism, First Communion, confirmation. He learned about sin and redemption, heaven and hell, saints and sinners. But the religious teachings never really took root in Peter's mind the way Francis hoped they would. Peter heard the words, performed the rituals, but the deeper meaning slid right past him. What Peter took from Catholicism wasn't spiritual enlightenment or moral guidance. It was guilt. Deep, pervasive, irrational Catholic guilt that would follow him into adulthood. Even as Peter repeatedly ignored Catholic teachings about fidelity, temperance, and treating others with respect, he couldn't shake the fundamental guilt that came with being raised in such a strict religious environment. This guilt never stopped him from doing anything, but it occasionally made him feel bad about it afterward, which is about as close to religious observance as Peter would get. Peter's teenage years were marked by continued mediocrity and searching for something he couldn't quite name. He wasn't preparing for college. He wasn't planning a career. He was just existing, day to day, trying to get through high school without too much pain or embarrassment. He worked part-time jobs to have spending money, nothing impressive or noteworthy. He went to movies, watched television, and discovered a love for pop culture that would become a lifelong obsession. Francis pushed Peter to get a real job after high school, to learn a trade, or find steady work that would support him as an adult. The idea of Peter pursuing higher education never even came up, either because Francis didn't think Peter was smart enough or because the Griffin family finances couldn't support it. So Peter entered the workforce with no particular skills, no clear direction, and no real ambitions beyond getting by. Peter's employment history before landing at the Pawtucket Brewery is a chaotic mess of odd jobs and brief stints at various establishments. He worked at a fishing boat, where his incompetence nearly got everyone killed. He tried his hand at several factory jobs, none of which lasted long. He worked retail, where his inability to deal with customers politely got him fired repeatedly. He delivered pizza, washed dishes, worked construction, and held probably a dozen other jobs that he barely remembers. What's remarkable about Peter's pre-brewery employment history is how thoroughly he failed at everything while somehow never becoming completely destitute. He always landed another job. Something always came through. Whether this was luck, privilege, or the simple fact that in the economy of the 1980s, even incompetent white men could find steady work is open to interpretation. But Peter bounced from job to job, never staying anywhere long enough to develop real skills or build a career. During this period of directionless employment, Peter was living in a small apartment, probably in or near Providence, spending his free time drinking beer and watching television. His social life was limited. He didn't have a core group of friends yet. He wasn't dating anyone seriously. He was just existing, waiting for something to happen, though he couldn't have told you what he was waiting for. And then he met Lois Schmidt, and everything changed. The exact circumstances of how Peter and Lois met have been told in different ways over the years, with various episodes providing conflicting details. In one version, they met when Lois was working as a stewardess and Peter was a passenger. In another, they met at a party. In yet another telling, they encountered each other at a historical reenactment where Lois was playing a colonial woman. The truth is probably some combination of these events, with Peter and Lois crossing paths multiple times before the relationship truly began. What's consistent across all the retellings is the instant attraction Peter felt toward Lois. She was beautiful, sophisticated, educated, and way out of his league. By every reasonable measure, Peter had no business pursuing someone like Lois Schmidt. She came from money. She had culture. She'd traveled the world. She could play piano beautifully and spoke multiple languages. Peter brought nothing comparable to the table. He was working a nothing job, living in a tiny apartment, and his idea of culture was knowing all the words to the theme song from the A-Team. But Peter had something that appealed to Lois in that moment of her life. He was genuine. He wasn't trying to impress her with money or status because he had neither. He wasn't playing social games or calculating angles. He just liked her and wanted to spend time with her. For Lois, who'd spent her entire life surrounded by people who wanted something from her family, Peter's straightforward interest was refreshing. He liked her for her, not for her last name or her trust fund. Peter courted Lois with the enthusiasm and creativity that he brought to everything that truly mattered to him. He wasn't smooth or sophisticated, but he was earnest. He took her on dates that were memorable, even if they weren't expensive. He made her laugh with his genuine enthusiasm for life and his willingness to look foolish if it meant making her smile. He introduced her to working-class pleasures she'd never experienced: cheap beer, dive bars, greasy food, and the simple joy of not having to maintain appearances. The relationship moved quickly, probably too quickly by conventional standards. But both Peter and Lois were looking for something different from what their families expected of them. For Peter, Lois represented acceptance and approval from someone who actually mattered. She saw potential in him that Frances Griffin never had. For Lois, Peter represented freedom from the constraints of her upbringing and the chance to build a life based on love rather than social expectations. When Peter asked Lois to marry him, he was terrified she'd say no. He proposed with a ring he couldn't really afford, purchased with money saved from multiple paychecks and probably some borrowed funds. It wasn't a Peter Schmidt quality ring. It wasn't the kind of ring Lois's mother would have approved of. But Lois said yes anyway, and in that moment, Peter's life gained a direction it had never had before. The wedding itself was a clash of cultures that foreshadowed decades of family tension to come. The Griffins, what few family members Peter actually liked enough to invite, represented working-class Catholic Rhode Island. The Schmidts represented old-money Protestant aristocracy. Carter Schmidt attended the wedding, but made his disapproval clear throughout. He gave a toast that was more insult than celebration. He questioned Peter about his prospects, his plans, his ability to provide for Carter's daughter. Peter had no good answers to these questions because he had no real plans beyond loving Lois and hoping things worked out. After the wedding, Peter and Lois moved to Quahog and set up their household at 31 Spooner Street. The house was modest, a 2-story structure that was affordable on Peter's working-class salary. It wasn't what Lois had grown up with, but it was theirs. Peter needed to find steady employment, something more reliable than the parade of odd jobs he'd been working. He needed to prove to Lois, and probably to himself, that he could be a provider. This is when Peter landed the job at the Pawtucket Brewery that would become his primary employment for decades. How exactly Peter got this job is somewhat unclear. His qualifications were minimal. His work history was spotty. But somehow, he got hired at the brewery's shipping department, working the line and eventually operating a forklift. It was union work, which meant decent pay, benefits, and job security that would prove nearly impossible to lose, despite Peter's countless screw-ups over the years. The brewery job was perfect for Peter in many ways. It didn't require advanced education or specialized skills. It was repetitive enough that Peter could do it without too much thought, leaving his mind free to wander. And it provided the stability that allowed him to support his growing family. Peter would work at the Pawtucket Brewery for years, somehow surviving downsizings, reorganizations, and his own incompetence through a combination of luck, union protection, and the apparently low standards of the brewery's management. It was also at the brewery, or around this time in Quahog, that Peter formed the friendships that would define his adult life. He met Glenn Quagmire, a pilot who lived next door and whose sexual appetites would both amuse and disturb Peter over the years. He met Joe Swanson, a police officer who moved into the neighborhood and became one of Peter's closest friends, despite their very different personalities. And most importantly, he reunited with Cleveland Brown, whom Peter had actually known years earlier, though their friendship deepened significantly once they were both settled in Quahog. The formation of this friend group was crucial to Peter's identity. For the first time in his life, Peter had a real crew, a group of guys who accepted him, wanted to hang out with him, and made him feel like he belonged. They started hanging out at the Drunken Clam, a local bar that became their second home. They'd drink beer, tell stories, watch sports, and just exist together without judgment or expectations. For Peter, who'd spent his childhood desperate for approval and his teenage years isolated, this friendship group was everything. Around the same time, Peter's family started growing. Lois became pregnant with their first child, Meg, and Peter faced the terrifying reality of becoming a father. This was not something Peter felt prepared for. He had no model of good fatherhood from his own childhood. Francis Griffin had been harsh and distant, more critic than caretaker. Peter had no idea how to be a dad, and his anxiety about this was probably justified given how his parenting would actually turn out. Meg's birth didn't immediately transform Peter into a responsible adult, but it did add a new dimension to his life. He was a father now. He had responsibilities beyond just showing up to work and making Lois happy. There was a tiny human depending on him, and that should have been a wake-up call. Should have been. Instead, Peter mostly felt confused by fatherhood, and gradually developed a dynamic with Meg that would become problematic as she grew older. A few years after Meg came, Chris, and a couple years after that came Stewie. With each child, the Griffin household became more chaotic, louder, and more expensive. Peter's brewery salary stretched further than it probably should have, another example of the show's somewhat flexible relationship with economic reality. Lois stopped working to raise the children, which meant the family depended entirely on Peter's income. This should have motivated Peter to be more responsible, to work harder, to maybe seek promotions or better opportunities. But that's not who Peter is. Peter doesn't plan for the future. He doesn't think strategically about his career or his family's financial security. He lives entirely in the present, reacting to whatever's happening right now without much consideration for consequences or long-term impacts. This trait, which might be charming in a child or young adult, becomes increasingly problematic as Peter ages and his responsibilities grow. Over the years, Peter's employment has actually been more varied than just the brewery. He's been fired and rehired more times than anyone can count. He's worked at toy factories, founded his own businesses, worked in television, tried his hand at various entrepreneurial schemes, and held dozens of other jobs for brief periods. But he always ends up back at the brewery, or at some equivalent working-class job, because that's where Peter functions best. He needs structure imposed from outside. He needs a boss to tell him what to do, and coworkers to keep him company. One of the most significant revelations in Peter's adult life was discovering the truth about his biological father. For decades, Peter believed Francis Griffin was his real dad, even though their relationship was terrible. Learning that Mickey McFinnigan was actually his biological father should have been devastating, but instead, it was almost liberating. It explained so much about why Francis treated him the way he did. It wasn't just that Peter was a disappointment. It was that Peter was a daily reminder of Thelma's betrayal. Meeting Mickey McFinnigan and developing a relationship with his real father gave Peter something he'd never had: approval from a father figure. Mickey liked Peter. He found Peter funny and interesting. He didn't criticize Peter's weight or intelligence or life choices. For the first time, Peter had a father who was actually proud of him, or at least neutral enough not to make him feel terrible. This relationship was complicated by the fact that Mickey was still working at a brewery and living a pretty aimless life himself. But for Peter, having any positive father figure was a massive improvement. Francis Griffin's death should have been a significant moment for Peter, a chance to process decades of complicated feelings about his father. And in some ways, it was. Peter felt guilty about his relief at Francis's death. He felt sad about the father-son relationship they never had, but he also felt freed from the weight of Francis's judgment and criticism. After Francis died, Peter could finally stop trying to earn approval from someone who would never give it. Peter's relationship with Lois has been tested countless times over the years. He's been unfaithful, though usually through stupidity rather than malice. He's endangered the family financially with his harebrained schemes. He's embarrassed Lois in front of her family, her friends, and the entire town on multiple occasions. He's forgotten anniversaries, birthdays, and other important dates. He's prioritized his friends and his own entertainment over his family's needs more times than anyone could count. Yet Lois stays with Peter. Why? That's a complicated question with no simple answer. Part of it is genuine love. When Peter and Lois connect, when they remember why they fell in love, there's real chemistry and affection there. Peter can be sweet and romantic when he tries. He has moments of clarity where he recognizes how lucky he is to have Lois. Part of it is probably sunk cost fallacy. Lois gave up her family's wealth and approval for Peter. Admitting the marriage was a mistake would mean admitting she made the wrong choice all those years ago. But there's something else too. Peter gives Lois a kind of freedom she wouldn't have with anyone else. A more successful, responsible husband would come with expectations about how Lois should behave, what kind of wife she should be. Peter doesn't expect anything from Lois except that she stick around. He doesn't try to control her or limit her. He's so wrapped up in his own interests that Lois has space to be herself in ways she might not with a different partner. Peter's parenting style, if it can be called that, is basically benign neglect mixed with occasional bursts of misguided enthusiasm. He largely ignores Meg, to the point where the family's treatment of her has become emotionally abusive. He relates to Chris mostly through shared interests in television and juvenile humor. And his relationship with Stewie is complicated by the fact that Peter often seems completely unaware that Stewie is a genius baby with murderous tendencies and advanced technology. As Peter has aged, he hasn't really matured. He's the same impulsive, childish person he was at 20. Just with more responsibilities, he's no better equipped to handle. His body has taken the toll of decades of excessive drinking and poor diet. His mental faculties, never particularly sharp, have arguably declined, but his enthusiasm for life hasn't dimmed. Peter still approaches each day with the expectation that something interesting might happen, that adventure might be just around the corner. Peter's lack of intelligence is a defining characteristic, but it's worth noting that Peter isn't consistently dumb. He has moments of surprising insight or competence, usually when the plot requires it. He can be clever when he needs to be. He's shown genuine talent at various skills when the story calls for it. This inconsistency is part of the show's cartoon logic, but it also suggests that Peter's stupidity is at least partially willful. He doesn't think things through because thinking is hard, and he'd rather not bother. What makes Peter Griffin fascinating as a character is that he's simultaneously infuriating and endearing. He causes chaos wherever he goes. He hurts people, usually unintentionally, but sometimes through sheer selfishness. He's a bad employee, a worse father, and a mediocre husband on his best days. By any objective measure, Peter is a disaster of a human being. Yet he's also capable of genuine love, unexpected kindness, and moments of surprising wisdom. He loves his friends deeply and would do anything for them. He loves Lois, even if he shows it poorly. And despite his terrible parenting, there are moments when he connects with his kids in meaningful ways. Peter represents something very specific in American culture: the mediocre white man who fails upward through life despite having no particular talents or virtues. He keeps his job despite being terrible at it. He maintains his marriage despite being a problematic husband. He survives countless injuries and dangerous situations that should kill him. He faces no real consequences for his actions. In this way, Peter is both a satirical critique of this type of privilege and a celebration of the absurd resilience of the American working-class male. As we move forward through the Griffin family's story, Peter remains the center of chaos around which everything else revolves. His decisions drive the plot. His stupidity creates the conflicts. His relationships with everyone around him form the backbone of the show's emotional core. Understanding Peter means understanding the show itself, because in many ways, Family Guy is really just the story of how one incredibly dumb but weirdly lucky man navigates life in early 21st century America. Peter Griffin is a man who should have failed at everything, but somehow keeps succeeding, at least by his own very low standards. He's found love, friendship, stable employment, and a place in his community, despite possessing almost no qualities that should make any of that possible. He's the protagonist of his own story, and somehow, against all odds and logic, that story keeps going year after year after year. Section 3. Lois Griffin. From Privilege to Motherhood. Lois Patrice. Pewterschmidt. Griffin is perhaps the most complex and underestimated character in the entire Family Guy universe. On the surface, she appears to be the typical animated sitcom wife, the patient, long-suffering anchor who keeps her chaotic family from completely falling apart. But beneath that surface lies a woman with a wild past, hidden talents, suppressed desires, and a psychological complexity that makes her far more interesting than she initially appears. Understanding Lois means understanding how a woman born into extraordinary privilege chose to give it all up for love, and how that choice has shaped every aspect of her life ever since. Lois was born into the Pewterschmidt family, one of the wealthiest and most influential dynasties in New England. The Pewterschmidt fortune stretches back generations, built initially through shipping and manufacturing in the 19th century, then expanded through strategic investments, media ownership, and the kind of ruthless business practices that defined the robber baron era. By the time Lois was born in the early 1950s, the Pewterschmidt name carried weight in social, political, and economic circles throughout the Northeast. Growing up as a Pewterschmidt meant something very specific. It meant private schools where your classmates' families owned banks and newspapers. It meant summers in Martha's Vineyard and winters in Aspen. It meant knowing from an early age that you were part of an elite class, that the rules that applied to ordinary people didn't necessarily apply to you, and that with great wealth came great expectations about how you would behave and who you would become. The Pewterschmidt mansion in Newport, Rhode Island, where Lois spent her childhood, was more than just a house. It was a statement of power and permanence. The estate sprawled across multiple acres, featuring formal gardens maintained by a staff of groundskeepers, a main house with more rooms than Lois ever bothered counting, guest houses, servants' quarters, stables, and all the other amenities that came with being genuinely wealthy rather than merely rich. The house had been in the family for generations, filled with art, antiques, and the accumulated treasures of a family that had been collecting them for over a century. Carter Pewterschmidt ruled this empire with an iron fist disguised by a velvet glove. He was charming when he needed to be, ruthless when the situation called for it, and always focused on expanding and protecting the family fortune. Carter's business philosophy was simple. Everything and everyone has a price, and if you can't buy something, you probably don't want it badly enough. He approached relationships as transactions, politics as a game to be won, and family as a legacy to be managed, rather than people to be loved. Barbara Pewterschmidt, Lois's mother, was the perfect complement to Carter's ambitions. She came from old money herself, the daughter of a prominent banking family, and she understood instinctively how society games were played at that level. Barbara's role was to manage the social aspects of the Pewterschmidt empire, hosting charity galas that raised money while cementing alliances, serving on museum boards that provided cultural capital, and ensuring that her children understood their place in the social hierarchy. Lois grew up with her brother Patrick in this rarefied atmosphere, and from the beginning, it was clear she was different from what her parents expected. While Patrick seemed to embrace the family worldview, seeing himself as inherently superior due to his birth, Lois questioned everything. She asked why they had so much when others had so little. She wondered why the servants' children couldn't play with her. She expressed interest in people and experiences that Barbara considered beneath their station. As a young girl, Lois showed artistic talent, particularly in music. She took piano lessons from a renowned instructor, someone who'd trained at prestigious conservatories and taught the children of the elite. Lois was a natural. Her fingers moved across the keys with grace and precision. She could read music effortlessly, had perfect pitch, and possessed the kind of musical intuition that couldn't be taught. Barbara was pleased by this development, seeing it as appropriately cultured, the kind of accomplishment that would make Lois a desirable wife for someone from an equally prominent family. But Lois's musical interests didn't stay confined to the classical repertoire Barbara approved of. As she entered her teenage years, Lois discovered rock and roll, jazz, and blues. She was fascinated by the raw emotion in this music, the way it expressed feelings that her classical training never accessed. She started teaching herself to play rock songs, staying up late in her room with headphones on, learning guitar chords, and experimenting with different styles. This was Lois's first real rebellion, and it was significant. Music was supposed to be her acceptable outlet, the ladylike accomplishment that would make her marriageable. By taking her musical talent in directions her mother didn't approve of, Lois was asserting her independence and rejecting the path that had been laid out for her. She wasn't going to be the refined society wife who played Chopin at dinner parties. She was going to be something else, even if she didn't quite know what yet. Lois attended an exclusive private school where the student body consisted almost entirely of children from wealthy families. She was expected to do well academically, not because education itself mattered to the Pewterschmidts, but because good grades and prestigious college admissions were markers of status. Lois was a good student, intelligent and capable, but she never seemed particularly invested in the academic competition that consumed many of her classmates. She did her work, earned her grades, and spent her free time pursuing interests that had nothing to do with impressing college admissions officers. During her high school years, Lois's rebellious streak intensified. She snuck out to concerts, forging her mother's signature on permission slips or simply climbing out her window after everyone was asleep. She attended rock shows in Providence and Boston, standing in crowded clubs surrounded by people from completely different social classes, feeling more alive and authentic than she ever did at the country club. She experimented with her appearance, trying styles that horrified Barbara: torn jeans, band t-shirts, darker makeup than a proper Pewterschmidt girl should wear. The tension between Lois and her parents grew throughout her teenage years. Barbara couldn't understand why her daughter, who had every advantage, insisted on associating with riffraff and pursuing interests that were beneath her breeding. Carter, who'd hoped his daughter would marry well and extend the family's social network, watched in frustration as Lois showed no interest in the suitable young men from appropriate families who were paraded before her at various social functions. Patrick, Lois's brother, took a very different path. He embraced the family's wealth and privilege without question, developing into exactly the kind of heir Carter wanted, at least on the surface. But Patrick had dark currents running beneath his polished exterior, tendencies toward violence and extremism that would eventually manifest in disturbing ways. The Pewterschmidt family's dysfunction ran deep, masked by wealth and social standing, but no less real for being hidden behind mansion walls. After high school, Lois was expected to attend a prestigious women's college, marry someone from an approved list of suitable families, and settle into the life of a society wife. But Lois had other plans. She did attend college, but she used it as an opportunity to further explore life beyond the Pewterschmidt bubble. She studied music seriously, taking classes in composition and music history. She joined bands, playing piano and keyboards in groups that performed at local venues. She dated musicians and artists, the kind of men who would have been shown the door immediately if they'd tried to court her at the family mansion. It was during this period that Lois had her first serious taste of independence. She wasn't living at home anymore. She had her own money, a generous allowance from her parents that they assumed she'd spend on appropriate clothes and activities. Instead, Lois used it to fund a lifestyle that would have horrified them. She lived in an apartment off campus with roommates who weren't from prominent families. She worked part-time jobs, not because she needed the money, but because she wanted to understand what normal people's lives were like. She experimented with drugs in the way that college students in the 1970s often did, though she never went too far down that road. After college, instead of returning to Newport and the life her parents expected, Lois pursued a career as a professional musician. She played piano in hotel lounges and jazz clubs. She auditioned for bands and took gigs wherever she could get them. She even had a brief period fronting a rock band, singing and playing keyboards, living the life of a working musician trying to make it in a competitive industry. This period of Lois's life is often glossed over in the present-day narrative of Family Guy, but it was formative. She learned to support herself through her talents. She navigated the music industry, which was often sexist and exploitative, and held her own. She performed for crowds, dealt with difficult venue owners, and experienced the particular satisfaction that comes from creating art that moves people. She was genuinely talented, talented enough that she might have built a real career in music if circumstances had been different. But the music industry in the 1970s was not kind to women, especially women trying to be taken seriously as musicians, rather than just as pretty faces to put on stage. Lois faced constant harassment, condescension from male musicians who assumed she couldn't really play, and pressure to sexualize her performances in ways that made her uncomfortable. She stuck with it for a while, but the constant grind and the lack of respect eventually wore her down. Lois also worked as a model during this period, another choice that enraged her parents. The Pewterschmidts believed that displaying yourself for money, even in the relatively respectable world of professional modeling, was beneath their dignity. But Lois found modeling work empowering in some ways. She was being paid for her appearance, yes, but she was also in control of her image, in ways she hadn't been as a society daughter. She worked for magazines and catalogs, earning her own money and making her own decisions about which jobs to take. The modeling work led to a job as a stewardess, another career choice that horrified the Pewterschmidts. Being a stewardess in the 1970s and early 1980s was seen as glamorous by some, but Barbara Pewterschmidt saw it as little better than being a waitress. Her daughter, who should have been attending charity luncheons and serving on museum boards, was serving drinks to travelers and dealing with crying babies on airplanes. It was mortifying. But for Lois, being a stewardess was freedom. She traveled constantly, seeing parts of the country and world she'd never visited despite her family's wealth. She met people from every walk of life. She had adventures and experiences that had nothing to do with her last name or her trust fund. She was Lois the stewardess, not Lois Pewterschmidt, heiress. And that anonymity was intoxicating. It was during this free-spirited period of her life that Lois met Peter Griffin. The exact circumstances have been told different ways, but what's consistent is that Peter represented something Lois had been searching for without fully realizing it. Authenticity without pretension. Peter wasn't trying to impress her or use her for her connections. He just liked her. He thought she was beautiful and funny and interesting, and he wanted to spend time with her. For a woman who'd spent her entire life around people who calculated every interaction based on social advantage, Peter's straightforward affection was refreshing. Lois's decision to marry Peter was the ultimate rebellion against her upbringing. She wasn't just choosing a husband her parents didn't approve of. She was choosing a complete life change. Marriage to Peter meant giving up the safety net of the Pewterschmidt fortune. It meant accepting that she'd live in a modest house in a working-class neighborhood. It meant her children would attend public schools instead of private academies. It meant she'd be doing her own housework instead of supervising servants. It meant, essentially, choosing love and authenticity over comfort and privilege. Carter's threat to cut Lois off financially wasn't just about controlling his daughter. It was about maintaining the family's standards. In Carter's worldview, Allowing Lois to marry someone like Peter without consequences would signal that the Pewterschmidt name didn't mean what it was supposed to mean. It would suggest that breeding and social position didn't matter. Carter couldn't allow that, so he followed through on his threat, cutting Lois off from direct access to the family fortune. But the Pewterschmidts couldn't stay away completely. Family ties among the wealthy are complicated. Carter eventually came back around, maintaining a relationship with Lois and her children, even as he never stopped insulting Peter and making clear his belief that Lois had married beneath herself. Barbara similarly maintained contact, though she could never quite hide her disappointment in the life Lois had chosen. Marriage to Peter was undoubtedly an adjustment for Lois. The first years were probably harder than she let on. Going from the Pewterschmidt mansion to a modest house in Quahog meant dealing with realities she'd never faced before. Budgeting became necessary. She had to learn to cook, clean, and manage a household without staff. She had to navigate relationships with Peter's working-class friends and their wives. Coming from such a different background that it was sometimes hard to find common ground. But Lois adapted. She became a capable homemaker, learning domestic skills that had never been necessary when she had servants. She became a mother, and while she had access to money from her parents for emergencies, she chose to raise her children largely without the advantages she'd grown up with. She wanted them to be normal kids, not privileged Pewterschmidts being groomed for a life of elite social climbing. Lois's parenting style reflects her own complicated upbringing. She's more engaged and affectionate than Barbara ever was, genuinely involved in her children's lives and interested in their well-being. But she also has blind spots, particularly when it comes to Meg. The family's treatment of Meg borders on abuse, and while Lois is less cruel than Peter, she participates in the dismissal and neglect that defines Meg's home life. This suggests that despite Lois's conscious efforts to be a better parent than her own mother, she's still carrying forward some dysfunctional patterns. With Chris, Lois is more patient and understanding. She recognizes his artistic sensibility and tries to nurture it, even when Peter mocks it. She understands Chris in ways that mirror her own creative inclinations. But even here, Lois sometimes fails to protect Chris from Peter's more damaging behaviors, or to push back against the low expectations everyone has for her son. Lois's relationship with Stewie is perhaps most interesting because it reveals the gaps between what Lois knows and what she acknowledges. She clearly understands on some level that Stewie is far more advanced than a typical baby, but she often treats him as a normal infant, perhaps as a coping mechanism. Acknowledging that her youngest child is a genius with murderous tendencies and access to advanced technology would require a response that Lois isn't equipped to provide. Throughout her years in Quahog, Lois has maintained aspects of her pre-Peter identity while sublimating others. She still plays piano beautifully, usually at home for her own satisfaction rather than for audiences. She's occasionally taught piano lessons to local children, connecting her musical talent to the community. But the rock and roll rebelliousness of her youth has been largely channeled into more socially acceptable outlets, or suppressed entirely. Lois's hidden wild side emerges periodically throughout the series, usually when she's pushed to her breaking point, or when circumstances force her to tap into the more adventurous person she used to be. She's revealed to have training in martial arts, suggesting she spent time studying fighting techniques at some point before her marriage. She's shown to have connections to and knowledge of various subcultures and activities that don't fit with her current suburban mother image. She's even revealed to have had a career as an adult film actress under the name Seabreeze during her rebellious period, though this is one of the more controversial and potentially non-canon revelations about her past. What becomes clear when examining Lois's full backstory is that she's a woman of considerable talents and capabilities, who's chosen to focus those abilities on maintaining her family rather than pursuing personal ambitions. This choice isn't presented as tragic exactly, but there's an undercurrent of sacrifice and sublimated desire throughout her character. She loves her family, but there are moments when you can see her wondering what her life might have been if she'd made different choices. Lois's relationship with her parents has evolved over the decades, but never fully healed. Carter still sees Peter as a disappointment and never misses an opportunity to remind Lois that she could have done better. Barbara maintains a relationship with her grandchildren, but can't help making subtle digs about their upbringing and circumstances. Family gatherings at the Pewterschmidt mansion are tense affairs where the class divide between the Griffins and the Pewterschmidts is impossible to ignore. Yet Lois has found genuine happiness in aspects of her Quahog life. She has real friendships with women like Bonnie Swanson, relationships based on shared experiences rather than social positioning. She's active in the community, volunteering at the children's schools, and participating in town events. She's built a life that, while far from the privilege she was born into, has authenticity and meaning that her childhood lacked. The most telling aspect of Lois's character is her choice to stay with Peter, despite countless reasons to leave. Peter has been unfaithful, though usually through stupidity rather than malice. He's endangered the family financially more times than anyone can count. He's embarrassed her in front of her parents, her children, and the entire town. He's forgotten important dates, ignored her needs, and prioritized his friends and his own entertainment over his family. By any objective measure, Lois would be justified in leaving Peter and either finding someone more suitable or simply living independently. But Lois stays. She stays because, despite everything, she genuinely loves Peter. She stays because the alternative, admitting her marriage was a mistake and returning to her parents' world, is unthinkable. She stays because her children need stability, even if that stability comes from an unstable source. She stays because Peter, for all his faults, gives her something she never had in her privileged upbringing: the freedom to be imperfect herself. Lois isn't a saint. She has a temper that can explode spectacularly when pushed too far. She's capable of violence when sufficiently provoked, usually by Peter's more egregious behavior. She's shown jealousy, pettiness, and her own form of selfishness. She sometimes uses her sexuality manipulatively, leveraging Peter's attraction to her to get what she wants. She's not above lying, scheming, or bending rules when it serves her purposes. In short, Lois is human in ways that her perfect society wife image was never allowed to be. The tension in Lois's character between her privileged background and her working class present creates a fascinating complexity. She can navigate both worlds, comfortable at a high society gala or a dive bar, but fully belonging to neither. She understands wealth and power in ways that Peter and most of Quahog never will, but she's chosen to live without them. This gives her a unique perspective and set of capabilities that emerge when needed. Lois's hidden past periodically resurfaces in ways that shock her family and the community. She's revealed to have had adventures, acquired skills, and lived experiences that don't fit with her current suburban mother image. Each revelation adds another layer to understanding who Lois really is beneath the surface. Not just a patient wife and mother, but a complex woman with her own history, desires, and capabilities. As the years have passed and her children have grown, Lois has faced the reality of middle age and the questions it brings. She's maintained her appearance impressively well, another advantage of her genetics and her knowledge of how to present herself. But she's also confronted the fact that she's no longer young, that opportunities she passed up aren't coming back, and that the choices she made decades ago have permanently shaped her life's trajectory. Yet Lois seems largely at peace with her choices, or at least resigned to them. She chose love over privilege, authenticity over status, and chaos over predictability. She got exactly what she chose: a husband who frustrates her constantly but loves her genuinely, children who are deeply flawed but uniquely themselves, and a life that's messy and chaotic but never boring. For a woman who spent her childhood in the stifling perfection of the Pewterschmidt mansion, perhaps that chaos is its own form of freedom. Lois Pewterschmidt Griffin is ultimately a woman who made an audacious choice and has spent decades living with the consequences. She gave up everything that came with her family name for love and independence. She traded privilege for authenticity, comfort for freedom, and a predictable future for an uncertain present. Whether that trade was worth it is a question Lois probably doesn't let herself examine too closely, because the answer might be too complicated to face. But one thing is certain: Lois is far more than the patient sitcom wife she sometimes appears to be. She's a woman with depth, complexity, and a past that continues to influence her present in ways both obvious and subtle. Meg Griffin is perhaps the most tragic character in the entire Family Guy universe, and that's saying something in a show filled with dysfunction, cruelty, and dark comedy. Meg's tragedy isn't rooted in dramatic backstory or traumatic events, though she's experienced plenty of those. Her tragedy is quieter, more insidious, and arguably more realistic than most animated suffering. Meg is the forgotten child, the scapegoat, the family member who absorbs everyone else's cruelty and neglect so thoroughly that it's become her defining characteristic. Understanding Meg means understanding how a person can be systematically diminished by the people who are supposed to love them most, and how that treatment shapes every aspect of their identity. Meg was born Megatron Griffin, named by Peter after the Transformers villain, which should have been everyone's first clue about how her life would go. Even her name was a joke, something Peter thought was hilarious, without considering what it would be like for a young girl to go through life with a name like Megatron. Lois eventually insisted on shortening it to Meg, but the damage was done. From her very first moment, Meg was treated as an afterthought, a punchline, something that happened to Peter and Lois, rather than a person they'd consciously chosen to bring into the world. Meg's early childhood was probably the best period of her life, relatively speaking. As a baby and toddler, she received the attention that parents naturally give their first child. Lois was a new mother, still learning how to care for an infant, and she devoted considerable time and energy to Meg's development. Peter, while never a particularly engaged father, at least showed some interest in his daughter during these early years. Baby Meg was cute, relatively easy to care for, and hadn't yet developed the personality traits that would make her family's favorite target. But things changed as Meg grew older, and her siblings were born. Chris arrived when Meg was still young enough to remember what it was like being an only child. Suddenly, there was a new baby demanding attention, and Meg found herself pushed to the side. Then Stewie was born, and whatever remaining parental attention Meg might have claimed was completely absorbed by the new baby, who was admittedly far more demanding and unusual than most infants. The shift in how the family treated Meg was gradual at first. It started with simple neglect, the natural result of parents who were overwhelmed by 3 children and didn't have enough time or energy to devote to all of them equally. Meg, as the oldest, was expected to be more independent, to need less attention, to be able to take care of herself while her parents focused on the younger children. This is a common dynamic in many families, and it's not necessarily damaging if handled with awareness and care. But the Griffin family didn't handle it with awareness and care. They handled it with increasing cruelty that transformed from passive neglect into active abuse. Peter, in particular, began treating Meg with open contempt that went far beyond typical father-daughter tension. He forgot her name regularly, calling her Meg with the same uncertain tone someone might use when guessing at a stranger's identity. He showed no interest in her life, her feelings, or her experiences. When Meg tried to share something with him, he'd tune her out or respond with insults. The really disturbing aspect of Meg's treatment isn't that Peter is a terrible father to her. It's that the entire family has collectively decided that treating Meg terribly is acceptable, even expected. Lois, who should be Meg's advocate and protector, participates in the cruelty. She's less overtly mean than Peter, but she dismisses Meg's feelings, ignores her needs, and allows Peter and the boys to abuse her without intervention. Chris, Meg's younger brother, treats his older sister with contempt and cruelty that would be shocking between siblings in a healthy family. Even Stewie, a baby, participates in mocking and degrading Meg. This family dynamic has created a situation where Meg has internalized her role as the family scapegoat. She's accepted that she exists to absorb everyone else's negative emotions, to be the target of their jokes, to be blamed when things go wrong. There are episodes where Meg actually defends this arrangement, arguing that the family needs her to be their emotional punching bag because otherwise they'd turn on each other. In Meg's worldview, her suffering serves a purpose. It keeps the family together by giving them a common target. This is heartbreaking psychological realism dressed up in cartoon absurdity. Meg has developed the classic mindset of an abuse victim. She's convinced that the abuse is necessary, that she deserves it, and that if she just tries hard enough to be better, maybe someday her family will love her. But the cruel truth is that nothing Meg does will change how her family treats her. because their treatment of her has nothing to do with who she is and everything to do with their own dysfunction. Meg's experiences at James Woods Regional High School mirror and magnify the rejection she faces at home. She's unpopular, mocked by her peers, and desperate for any form of acceptance or belonging. She's tried everything to fit in, changing her appearance, joining different social groups, pursuing various interests and activities. Nothing works. She remains the girl everyone makes fun of, the easy target for bullies, the person who's excluded from parties and social events. The really tragic aspect of Meg's social struggles is that she's not actually unpopular because of any inherent flaw or unlikable trait. She's unpopular because she reeks of desperation. Years of rejection at home have made Meg so hungry for acceptance that she tries too hard, cares too much, and can't hide how badly she wants to be liked. This desperation is repellent to teenagers, who can sense vulnerability and weakness the way sharks sense blood in water. Meg's peers reject her for the same reason her family does, because she allows herself to be rejected, because she's internalized the belief that she deserves rejection. Meg has experienced countless humiliations at school. She's been stood up, mocked, physically attacked, and subjected to cruel pranks that her peers think are hilarious. She's joined clubs and teams hoping to find belonging, only to be rejected or ridiculed there too. She's run for student government and been laughed at. She's tried out for sports teams and been cut. She's attempted to reinvent herself multiple times, each effort failing more spectacularly than the last. Her romantic life, or complete lack thereof, is another source of ongoing pain. Meg is desperate for romantic attention, for someone to see her as desirable and worthy of love. But her desperation sabotages any potential relationships before they can start. She develops intense crushes on boys who barely know she exists. When boys do show interest in her, they're usually using her for something. Homework help, making another girl jealous, or cruel pranks designed to humiliate her. Meg's most consistent crush throughout the series has been on Brian Griffin, the family dog. This is played for comedy, but it's actually deeply sad when you think about it. Meg has so little experience with kindness or respect from males in her life that when Brian occasionally treats her like a person rather than a punching bag, she interprets it as romantic interest. She's so starved for positive attention that the bare minimum of decency from the family pet seems like love. Brian, to his credit, has occasionally shown Meg genuine kindness and even respect. He's defended her when the rest of the family was being particularly cruel. He's given her advice and actually listened to her problems. But he's also taken advantage of her crush, making out with her when it suited his purposes, and then rejecting her when it became inconvenient. Even Brian, who should be above the family's cruelty, eventually participates in treating Meg as less than fully human. Meg has developed survival mechanisms to cope with her treatment. She's learned to make herself invisible, to not take up space, to not have needs or feelings that might inconvenience others. She apologizes constantly, even when she's done nothing wrong. She accepts blame for things that aren't her fault. She laughs at jokes made at her expense, playing along with her own degradation because resistance only makes the abuse worse. But beneath this meek exterior, Meg has rage. Deep, justified rage at how she's treated, at the unfairness of her life, at the fact that she did nothing to deserve this treatment, except have the misfortune of being born into this particular family. This rage occasionally erupts in spectacular fashion, usually when Meg reaches a breaking point and can no longer contain her anger and pain. In one notable episode, Meg finally snaps and tells her entire family exactly what she thinks of them. She calls out Peter's stupidity and selfishness, Lois's enabling behavior and vanity, Chris's laziness, and everyone's collective cruelty toward her. For a brief moment, Meg stands up for herself with righteous anger, forcing her family to confront the truth about how they treat her. It's a powerful moment of self-advocacy and boundary setting. But the episode ends with Meg backing down and returning to her role as the family scapegoat. She realizes, or convinces herself, that the family needs her to fill this role. That without her to absorb their dysfunction, they might actually hurt each other. So she goes back to accepting abuse, framing her submission as a noble sacrifice rather than what it actually is, a trauma response from someone who's been systematically broken down by years of mistreatment. This pattern repeats throughout the series. Meg will stand up for herself, briefly assert her worth, or find success outside the family. Then something will happen to push her back into her assigned role. The show treats this as comedy, as Meg's natural state of being, but it's actually a realistic depiction of how abuse victims get trapped in cycles they can't escape, even when opportunities for escape present themselves. Meg has genuine talents and positive qualities that her family never acknowledges or values. She's intelligent, more so than Chris, and arguably more so than Peter. She's musically talented, able to play clarinet well enough to be in the school band. She's artistic, creating drawings and other work that shows real skill. She's actually quite pretty when she's styled properly, and carrying herself with confidence, something that's occasionally revealed when the plot requires it. But none of these qualities matter in the Griffin household, where Meg's value has been predetermined to be zero. She could be a genius, a prodigy, a future Nobel Prize winner, and her family would still treat her as an inconvenient burden they have to tolerate. The cruelty she experiences isn't about anything she's done or failed to do. It's about the role the family has assigned her, and nothing she achieves will change that assignment. Meg's relationship with her mother is particularly complicated and painful. Lois is the one person who should be protecting Meg from the family's cruelty, but instead, she participates in it. Lois dismisses Meg's feelings, mocks her appearance and social status, and shows far more patience and affection toward her sons than toward her daughter. This maternal rejection cuts deeper than Peter's abuse because mothers are supposed to love their daughters unconditionally. The roots of Lois's treatment of Meg might connect to Lois's own complicated relationship with her mother, Barbara Pewterschmidt. Barbara was critical, distant, and focused on appearances and status rather than emotional connection. Lois has, perhaps unconsciously, recreated some of these dynamics with her own daughter. She's also possibly projecting her own insecurities onto Meg, seeing in her daughter's desperate need for acceptance an uncomfortable mirror of her own teenage rebellion and hunger for authentic connection. Chris's relationship with Meg is typical sibling rivalry amplified to cruel extremes. He's physically larger and stronger than Meg, and he uses this advantage to bully her. He insults her, hits her, and treats her with the casual cruelty that the family has normalized. Yet there are occasional moments where Chris shows genuine brotherly affection, suggesting that beneath the learned cruelty, there might be actual love that he's not allowed to express in a family that treats kindness to Meg as weakness. Stewie's treatment of Meg is perhaps the most absurd, given that he's a baby and she's a teenager. Yet Stewie participates in the family's mockery of Meg with enthusiasm, making jokes at her expense and treating her with the same contempt everyone else does. This reinforces just how thoroughly the treat Meg terribly message has permeated the Griffin household. Even the baby knows that Meg is the acceptable target. Meg's attempts to escape her family's treatment have taken various forms over the years. She's tried to become popular at school, thinking that social success might earn her family's respect. She's tried to excel academically, hoping achievements might make them proud. She's tried to change her appearance, her personality, her interests, anything that might make her more acceptable to the people around her. None of it has worked because the problem isn't Meg. The problem is everyone else. One of the most heartbreaking aspects of Meg's character is how her self-esteem has been so thoroughly destroyed that she accepts treatment that no one should accept. When boys use her or treat her badly, she thanks them for the attention. When her family abuses her, she apologizes for provoking them. When the world is cruel, she assumes she deserves it. This level of damaged self-worth is realistic for someone who's experienced the kind of systematic devaluation that Meg has endured. Meg has occasionally found temporary refuge or success outside her family. She's had brief periods where she excelled at something, found acceptance in a group, or experienced genuine happiness. But these victories are always temporary, and she's always pulled back into the family dynamic that defines her. The show seems to argue that this is Meg's natural state, that she's destined to be the scapegoat. But this framing ignores the fact that Meg's treatment is a choice the family makes, not an inevitable result of who Meg is. The most disturbing realization about Meg's situation is that everyone around her has normalized abuse to the point where they don't even recognize it as abuse anymore. When Meg is insulted, attacked, or neglected, no one steps in to defend her. Teachers at her school don't notice or don't care. Neighbors and family friends treat the Griffin family's cruelty toward Meg as an amusing quirk rather than a serious problem. The entire community has collectively agreed that treating Meg terribly is acceptable. This normalization of abuse is unfortunately realistic. In real life, when abuse happens openly and everyone participates or looks away, victims often have nowhere to turn. Meg can't go to a teacher, neighbor, or other family member for help because they're all part of the system that's harming her. She's trapped in a situation where the abuse is so normalized that pointing it out would make her seem oversensitive or attention-seeking rather than making people recognize the problem. Meg's future looks bleak from where she stands in high school. She's not being prepared for success or independence. Her family isn't supporting her college aspirations or helping her develop skills for adulthood. Her self-esteem is so damaged that she struggles to imagine a future where she's happy or successful. She's been taught that her role is to suffer, to be the scapegoat, to absorb everyone else's cruelty so they can feel better about themselves. But there's a glimmer of possibility in Meg's character. Despite everything, she hasn't been completely broken. She still has moments of assertiveness, flashes of anger that suggest she knows on some level that her treatment is wrong. She still tries, even when every attempt at success or acceptance has failed before. She still hopes, even though hope has been disappointed so many times. This resilience, while tragic in its futility, suggests that Meg has inner strength that might someday allow her to escape her circumstances. The really cruel irony of Meg's situation is that leaving home and cutting off her family would probably be the healthiest choice she could make. But Meg has been so thoroughly conditioned to believe she needs her family, that her role as scapegoat serves a purpose, that she likely won't make that choice. She'll probably remain trapped in this dynamic, accepting cruelty as love and abuse as family bonding, because it's all she's ever known. Meg Griffin represents something very real and very painful. The family scapegoat. The person who's designated to absorb all the dysfunction so everyone else can pretend they're fine. She's the evidence that something is deeply wrong in the Griffin household. And rather than addressing that wrongness, the family has decided to blame Meg for it. As long as everything is Meg's fault, no one else has to look at their own behavior or take responsibility for their own issues. In a better show, or a better world, Meg's story would have a redemptive arc. She'd realize her worth, establish boundaries, demand better treatment, and either force her family to change or leave them behind to build a healthier life elsewhere. But Family Guy isn't that kind of show, and Meg's tragedy is that she's trapped in a narrative that requires her to remain the scapegoat indefinitely. Her suffering is the price of the family's stability, and the show suggests that this arrangement, however cruel, is somehow necessary. Understanding Meg means understanding how systematic devaluation damages a person's sense of self, how abuse becomes normalized when everyone participates in it, and how difficult it is to escape a role that an entire system has assigned you. Meg is the forgotten child, the scapegoat, the acceptable target. And the real tragedy is that she's accepted this identity so completely that she can't imagine being anything else. Christopher Cross Griffin, named after the soft rock musician, is one of the most misunderstood characters in the Griffin household. On the surface, Chris appears to be simply the dumb kid, following in his father's footsteps of spectacular stupidity and low achievement. Teachers write him off. His parents have minimal expectations. His peers see him as an easy target for mockery. But beneath the obvious intellectual limitations and awkward adolescence lies something unexpected. A genuinely sensitive soul with real artistic talent and emotional depth that his family rarely acknowledges or nurtures. Chris was born the middle child, arriving a few years after Meg and a couple years before Stewie. This middle position in the birth order actually worked to Chris's advantage in ways it didn't for Meg. He wasn't the oldest child, carrying the weight of parental expectations and disappointment. He wasn't the baby demanding constant attention. He existed in a relatively protected middle space where he could develop his interests without too much interference or pressure. From an early age, Chris showed signs of being different from Peter in significant ways. While Peter's interests centered on television, drinking, and hanging out with his friends, Chris gravitated toward creative pursuits. He drew constantly, filling notebooks with sketches and doodles that showed genuine artistic ability. He was fascinated by visual art, spending hours watching Bob Ross paint happy little trees on PBS and trying to replicate the techniques. He had an eye for composition and color that suggested real talent. Peter largely ignored these artistic tendencies, unable to relate to them or see their value. In Peter's worldview, art was something weird people did, not a legitimate interest or potential career path. When Chris showed Peter his drawings, Peter would glance at them briefly and then change the subject to something he actually cared about, like sports or television shows. This dismissal wasn't necessarily cruel. It was simply Peter's complete inability to understand or appreciate something outside his narrow range of interests. Lois, having her own artistic background in music, should have been Chris's advocate and supporter. She recognized his talent and occasionally praised his work, but she didn't push back against Peter's dismissal or actively nurture Chris's abilities the way a parent truly invested in their child's development might. Lois was too busy managing the household chaos and dealing with Peter's antics to give Chris's artistic development the attention it deserved. Chris's academic performance has been consistently terrible throughout his school career. He struggles with reading, barely passes math, and shows little aptitude for traditional academic subjects. Teachers have labeled him as learning disabled, slow, or simply stupid. He's been placed in special education classes and remedial programs. His grades are so bad that his graduation from high school seems perpetually uncertain. But here's the thing about Chris's intelligence. He's not stupid in the way Peter is stupid. Peter's stupidity is broad and comprehensive, affecting every area of his life and thought process. Chris's struggles are more specific. He has difficulty with abstract reasoning and academic subjects, but he shows intelligence in other areas that school systems don't typically measure or value. His artistic ability requires visual intelligence, spatial reasoning, and creative problem solving. His emotional sensitivity demonstrates a kind of interpersonal intelligence that's quite sophisticated. Chris's relationship with his body and his developing sexuality has been a source of ongoing confusion and anxiety for him. He went through puberty early and hard, his body changing in ways that embarrassed and confused him. The show has made running jokes about Chris's puberty, including the infamous evil monkey that lived in his closet, which was eventually revealed to be a real monkey, but also served as a metaphor for Chris's adolescent anxieties and fears. Chris's sexuality has developed in directions that sometimes disturb his parents. He's attracted to older women, much older women in some cases, in ways that go beyond typical teenage fantasies. He's also shown attraction to unconventional body types and appearances. His sexual development doesn't follow the neat, predictable path that parents hope for, and this makes Peter uncomfortable in ways he doesn't know how to address. Rather than having honest conversations about sexuality and development, Peter either ignores Chris's questions or responds with crude jokes that don't actually help. One of the most fascinating aspects of Chris's character is his relationship with Herbert, the elderly neighbor who's clearly sexually attracted to Chris in ways that should be deeply concerning. The show plays this for comedy, with Herbert's predatory interest in Chris treated as a quirky character trait, rather than the serious threat it would be in reality. Chris seems largely oblivious to Herbert's intentions, interacting with him with a naive trust that's both innocent and concerning. Chris's friendships at school have been limited, but meaningful when they do develop. He's not popular, but he's also not as actively bullied as Meg. He exists in a kind of middle tier of the social hierarchy where he's mostly ignored rather than targeted. The friends he does make tend to be other outsiders, kids who are also struggling academically, socially awkward, or dealing with their own family issues. These friendships provide Chris with something his family often doesn't: acceptance without judgment. The most significant friendship in Chris's life has been with his younger brother Stewie, though calling it a friendship isn't quite accurate. Chris is often tasked with watching Stewie, and their interactions reveal Chris's better qualities. He's patient with Stewie in ways that Peter never is with any of his children. He plays with him, talks to him, and treats him with genuine affection. Chris doesn't seem to notice or care that Stewie is an evil genius baby plotting world domination. He just sees his little brother and treats him with kindness. Chris's emotional sensitivity manifests in unexpected ways throughout the series. He cries easily, not just from pain, but from emotional overwhelm. He's moved by beauty, whether it's in nature, art, or music. He forms deep attachments to people and things, and he grieves genuinely when he loses them. This emotional openness is rare in the Griffin household, where feelings are usually suppressed, mocked, or expressed through violence and crude humor. This sensitivity makes Chris vulnerable in a family and world that often mistakes sensitivity for weakness. Peter mocks Chris for crying or showing emotion. Peers at school see his emotional openness as an invitation to exploitation or mockery. Even Lois, who should understand and value emotional intelligence, sometimes dismisses Chris's feelings as excessive or inappropriate. Chris's artistic talent has occasionally been recognized outside the family. Art teachers have praised his work. He's won awards for his drawings. His skill is genuine and could potentially be developed into a career if he received proper training and support. But the family has no framework for understanding how artistic talent could translate into a viable future. Peter can't imagine how drawing pictures could lead to a job, so he dismisses it as a hobby at best and a waste of time at worst. The tragedy of Chris's situation is that he has real potential that's being squandered through neglect and low expectations. With proper educational support for his learning differences, encouragement of his artistic abilities, and genuine emotional support, Chris could develop into a successful, fulfilled adult. Instead, he's being prepared for a future that looks a lot like Peter's present, working a dead-end job, drinking beer with friends, and wondering why life feels so empty. Chris's relationship with Meg is complicated by the family's treatment of her. Chris participates in bullying Meg, calling her names and treating her cruelly in ways that mirror how Peter treats her. But Chris also occasionally shows Meg kindness that suggests he understands on some level that the family's treatment of her is wrong. He's caught between the family culture that demands participation in Meg's abuse and his own natural empathy that tells him hurting his sister is wrong. As Chris moves through high school and toward adulthood, questions about his future become increasingly urgent. What happens to a sensitive, artistic, academically struggling kid in a working-class town where art isn't valued and different kinds of intelligence aren't recognized? The likely answer, based on the trajectory the show has established, is that Chris will end up in a job that doesn't use his talents, probably following Peter into factory or manual labor work, drinking away his disappointment at the drunken clam while his artistic abilities atrophy from disuse. But there's another possibility, one the show occasionally hints at, but never fully explores. Chris could be the Griffin who breaks the cycle. His sensitivity and emotional intelligence, if he can protect them from being beaten down by life, could allow him to build a different kind of life than Peter has. His artistic talent, if he can find a way to develop it despite lack of family support, could open doors that education and traditional career paths won't. Chris has the potential to be the family's success story, the one who makes something of himself despite his circumstances. Understanding Chris means recognizing that intelligence comes in many forms, that artistic talent is real, even when it's not valued, and that emotional sensitivity is a strength rather than a weakness. Chris Griffin is not the dumb kid destined to become his father. He's a sensitive artist trapped in a family and educational system that can't see or nurture what makes him special. Whether he'll find a way to escape that trap or succumb to it remains one of the unresolved questions of his character. Stuart Gilligan Griffin, known universally as Stewie, is perhaps the most complex and fascinating character in the entire Family Guy universe. He began as a one-note joke, an evil baby genius bent on world domination and matricide, but has evolved over 2 decades into something far more interesting. A deeply complicated soul, struggling with identity, sexuality, loneliness, and the fundamental question of what it means to be human. Stewie's journey from villain to anti-hero to something approaching a real person is one of the show's most successful character developments. Stewie was born the third Griffin child, arriving with an inexplicably British accent, a football-shaped head, and apparently fully formed consciousness complete with advanced vocabulary and sinister intentions. From his very first moments, Stewie was different from any baby who'd ever existed in reality or fiction. He could speak in complete sentences, though most people around him couldn't understand him or interpreted his sophisticated speech as baby babbling. He possessed genius-level intelligence in multiple fields: engineering, physics, temporal mechanics, weapons design, and dozens of other disciplines that would take normal humans lifetimes to master. The early Stewie was defined almost entirely by two obsessions: killing his mother Lois and achieving world domination. His hatred for Lois was never fully explained, though it seemed to stem from the usual indignities of infancy: being dependent on someone else for basic needs, being trapped in a baby's body, the general frustration of being a genius consciousness imprisoned in an infant form. Stewie built elaborate weapons and devices designed to murder Lois in creative ways, though his schemes always failed, often because his baby body betrayed him at crucial moments. The world domination angle was more straightforward megalomania. Stewie saw himself as superior to all other humans and believed he should naturally rule them. He built mind control devices, weather machines, and other tools of conquest. He gave villainous speeches to his teddy bear Rupert about his plans for reshaping society once he seized power. He was, in essence, a classic supervillain who happened to be in diapers. But something shifted in Stewie's character over the years. The matricidal impulses faded. The world domination schemes became less frequent. Stewie's relationship with Lois transformed from murderous hatred to something more complex: genuine love mixed with typical mother-child frustration. The show never explicitly addressed this change, never had Stewie announce that he'd given up on killing his mother. It just gradually happened as the character evolved beyond his original one-note premise. Stewie's technological capabilities are genuinely astounding. He's built a working time machine that he uses regularly, casually violating the fundamental laws of physics and causality. He's created teleportation devices, shrinking rays, weather control systems, advanced AI, cloning technology, and weapons that would make military contractors weep with envy. He's accomplished all this while still in diapers, working out of his room with materials he somehow acquires despite being a baby with no income or legal ability to make purchases. The time machine deserves special attention because it's become central to many of Stewie's most important adventures. Stewie and Brian have traveled through time repeatedly, visiting different eras, meeting historical figures, and occasionally causing paradoxes or alternate timelines. These time travel adventures have revealed aspects of Stewie's character that wouldn't emerge in normal family situations. Away from Quahog, traveling through history with Brian, Stewie shows vulnerability, fear, loneliness, and a desperate need for connection that his usual genius persona hides. Stewie's relationship with Brian Griffin is the emotional core of his character. Brian is the only family member, possibly the only person in Quahog, who can always understand what Stewie is saying and treats him as an intellectual equal. They've become best friends, despite the age difference and species barrier. Brian is Stewie's confidant, adventure partner, and the closest thing to a peer that Stewie has in his isolated genius existence. The Brian-Stewie dynamic has produced some of the show's most emotionally genuine moments. When they're trapped in a bank vault together with no escape, they have honest conversations about fear, mortality, and what they mean to each other. When Brian temporarily dies, Stewie's grief is profound and genuine, driving him to desperate measures to undo Brian's death. These moments reveal that beneath Stewie's genius intellect and villainous posturing lies a lonely child, desperate for connection, and terrified of losing the few meaningful relationships he has. Stewie's sexuality has been one of the show's longest-running ambiguous elements. From early seasons, Stewie showed attraction to male characters, made comments suggesting homosexual orientation, and exhibited mannerisms that the show coded as stereotypically gay. But the show has never definitively stated Stewie's sexual orientation, maintaining an ambiguity that's sometimes interesting and sometimes feels like the writers avoiding commitment to character development. What's clear is that Stewie's relationship with his own identity is complicated. He's shown attraction to both males and females at different times. He's explored different aspects of his personality and presentation. He's struggled with questions about who he is and who he wants to be in ways that go beyond simple sexual orientation into deeper questions of identity and selfhood. Whether Stewie is gay, bisexual, still figuring things out, or something else entirely, remains deliberately unclear. Stewie's relationship with his teddy bear Rupert is one of the character's most humanizing elements. Rupert is Stewie's constant companion, the one being Stewie talks to when he's alone, the recipient of his fears and hopes and dreams. To Stewie, Rupert is fully real, a friend and confidant. To everyone else, Rupert is just a stuffed toy. This disconnect highlights Stewie's fundamental loneliness. His most important relationship is with an inanimate object, because no one else can truly understand him. The question of why Stewie is the way he is, why he was born with genius intelligence and a British accent, has never been satisfactorily answered. The show occasionally hints at explanations. Perhaps he's the result of some experiment, or maybe he's just a genetic anomaly. But mostly, Stewie's nature is treated as a given, something to be accepted rather than explained. He's a genius baby because that's what the show needs him to be. Stewie's family relationships beyond Brian are complicated by the fact that most of his family treats him like a normal baby. Lois changes his diapers and feeds him, seemingly oblivious to his advanced capabilities. Peter barely acknowledges Stewie's existence, beyond occasionally using him as a football or including him in schemes. Chris treats Stewie with affection, but doesn't seem to notice anything unusual about him. Only Meg occasionally hints at recognizing that Stewie is more than he appears. This creates a strange dynamic where Stewie exists in two worlds simultaneously. In one world, he's a normal baby subject to all the limitations and indignities of infancy. In another world, he's a genius with capabilities far beyond any adult. He's simultaneously the most powerful and most powerless member of the Griffin household. He can build time machines and weather control devices, but he still needs someone to change his diaper. Stewie's evolution from villain to complex character reflects the show's broader evolution from shock comedy to something with more emotional depth. Early Family Guy was content to have Stewie be a one-note joke, the evil baby who says shocking things. But as the show continued, the writers discovered there was more to explore with this character. Stewie's intelligence, his loneliness, his struggle with identity, his capacity for genuine emotion, all of this became more interesting than endless matricide plots. The time travel adventures, particularly the road to episodes with Brian, became vehicles for exploring Stewie's character in deeper ways. Stripped of the family context and placed in extraordinary circumstances, Stewie reveals layers that don't emerge in typical Quahog scenarios. We see his fear when facing genuine danger. We see his loyalty when Brian is threatened. We see his capacity for sacrifice, for growth, for change. Stewie's relationship with the concept of time itself is fascinating. He treats time travel casually, jumping through history as easily as normal people drive to the store. But this power has exposed him to profound existential questions. He's seen how small changes cascade into massive consequences. He's visited futures that horrify him and pasts that fascinate him. He's met alternate versions of himself and his family. This exposure to temporal complexity has given Stewie a unique perspective on existence that isolates him even further from normal experience. One of the most significant Stewie storylines involved his future self appearing to warn him about something, revealing a future where Stewie has become someone different, someone he doesn't want to be. These glimpses of potential futures show Stewie's anxiety about who he'll become, whether he'll maintain his genius as he ages, whether he'll find happiness or remain forever isolated by his intelligence. Stewie's capacity for violence remains despite his character evolution. He still builds weapons, still has a casual attitude toward killing, still possesses the technological means to cause mass destruction. But his motivations have shifted. Where early Stewie used violence in service of evil plans, current Stewie's violence is more reactive, defensive, or used in pursuit of goals that aren't purely selfish. He's gone from supervillain to something more like an amoral antihero. The most beautiful aspect of Stewie's character is his vulnerability. The moments when the genius persona drops and we see the scared, lonely child underneath. When he's sick and needs comfort, when he's afraid and seeks reassurance, when he's hurt and wants someone to care, we see that despite everything, Stewie is still a child who needs love, protection, and connection. The genius intellect doesn't change those fundamental needs. It just makes it harder for him to get them met. Understanding Stewie means recognizing him as perhaps the most fully realized character on the show. He's evolved from a simple joke into something approaching a real person with depth, contradictions, growth, and genuine emotional complexity. He's a genius and a child, powerful and vulnerable, isolated and desperate for connection. He's the character who's traveled furthest from his original conception, and in that journey, he's become the heart of many of the show's most emotionally resonant storylines. Brian Griffin is a dog who walks upright, drinks martinis, quotes literature, and considers himself an intellectual among Philistines. But beneath this pretentious exterior lies one of the show's most tragic figures: a failed writer, a chronic alcoholic, and a deeply insecure individual who uses pseudo-intellectualism to mask profound feelings of inadequacy. Brian's story is one of potential squandered, dreams deferred indefinitely, and the slow realization that being smarter than Peter Griffin doesn't actually make you smart. Brian's origins before joining the Griffin family remain somewhat mysterious, though we know he spent time on the streets as a stray before Peter found him and brought him home. This backstory is significant because it explains Brian's desperate need to belong somewhere, his fear of abandonment, and his willingness to tolerate the Griffin family's dysfunction in exchange for security and acceptance. Brian isn't just the family dog. He's a person who happens to be a dog, and the Griffins gave him something he'd never had before: a home. From the beginning, Brian positioned himself as the intellectual voice of reason in the Griffin household. He reads The New Yorker, listens to NPR, attends poetry readings, and makes a point of referencing books and films that demonstrate his cultural sophistication. He corrects Peter's grammar, rolls his eyes at Lois's suburban concerns, and generally acts superior to everyone around him. For years, this positioning worked because Brian was surrounded by people who were genuinely less educated and cultured than him, making his pretensions seem justified. But the show has gradually revealed that Brian's intellectualism is largely performative. He hasn't actually read many of the books he references. His political opinions are shallow and change based on who he's trying to impress. His taste in art and culture is more about signaling status than genuine appreciation. Brian is the human embodiment, or canine embodiment, of the pseudo-intellectual who's memorized enough cultural references to sound smart without developing actual depth or wisdom. The centerpiece of Brian's identity is his aspiration to be a writer, and this is where his failure is most profound and painful. Brian has been working on a novel for years, possibly over a decade. He talks about his writing constantly, describes himself as a writer when meeting new people, and treats his unpublished manuscript as evidence of his artistic soul. But Brian's writing is terrible. When people actually read his work, they find it pretentious, derivative, boring, and poorly constructed. Brian lacks the talent to match his aspirations. What makes Brian's writing failure particularly tragic is his complete inability to recognize or accept his lack of talent. When his novel is rejected by publishers, he blames the industry's shallowness or lack of vision. When people criticize his work, he dismisses them as unable to appreciate sophisticated literature. When faced with evidence that he's not a good writer, Brian retreats into defensive anger rather than using the feedback to improve. His dream of being a novelist has become an excuse for not pursuing achievable goals or developing real skills. Brian's alcoholism is treated as a character quirk, played for comedy with his martinis and wine, but it's actually a serious problem that affects every aspect of his life. Brian drinks constantly. He drinks alone. He drinks socially. He drinks when he's happy and when he's depressed. His alcohol consumption has shaped his personality, his decision-making, and his relationships. He's a functional alcoholic in the sense that he maintains his daily routines, but his drinking is clearly a coping mechanism for deeper issues he refuses to address. The relationship between Brian and Stewie has become the emotional core of both characters. They're best friends, despite the bizarre nature of their friendship. A dog and a baby, completely different in temperament and interests, yet profoundly connected. Brian treats Stewie as an equal, engaging with him intellectually and emotionally in ways that no one else in the family does. Their adventures together, particularly their time travel escapades, have created a bond that goes beyond simple friendship into something approaching family. When Brian temporarily died after being hit by a car, Stewie's grief was genuine and overwhelming. He mourned Brian deeply, refused to accept the replacement dog, and eventually used his time machine to prevent Brian's death, violating his own rules about temporal mechanics because losing Brian was unbearable. This storyline revealed how much these characters mean to each other, and how Brian's death would create a void in Stewie's life that couldn't be filled. Brian's romantic life is a disaster characterized by poor choices, shallow attractions, and an inability to maintain healthy relationships. He's attracted to women who are unavailable, inappropriate, or terrible matches for him. He's dated women far too young for him, pursued married women, and fallen for people who clearly don't respect him. When he does find someone compatible, he sabotages the relationship through his insecurity, dishonesty, or inability to commit. His most significant romantic relationship was probably with Jillian, a beautiful but intellectually limited woman who adored Brian despite their obvious incompatibility. Brian was attracted to Jillian physically, but embarrassed by her stupidity, treating her with condescension and cruelty. When she finally left him for someone who actually respected her, Brian was devastated, unable to recognize that he'd driven her away through his own behavior. This pattern repeats throughout Brian's romantic history. He wants to be loved, but treats his partners badly, then acts shocked when they leave. Brian's relationship with the Griffin family is complicated by the fact that he's simultaneously part of the family and apart from it. He's Peter's best friend, often joining Peter's schemes and adventures. He's Lois's confidant, someone she talks to when Peter's behavior becomes too much. He's protective of the children, particularly Stewie, but he's also the family dog, occasionally reminded of his lower status when it's convenient for the plot or the joke. The most controversial aspect of Brian's character is his relationship with Quagmire, or more specifically, Quagmire's intense hatred of him. In a famous episode, Quagmire delivers a devastating speech listing all of Brian's flaws: his pretentiousness, his hypocrisy, his treatment of women, his unearned sense of superiority. Every criticism Quagmire levels is accurate, calling Brian out for behavior the show had been excusing or playing for comedy for years. This moment forced both Brian and the audience to confront that Brian isn't the voice of reason he pretends to be. He's deeply flawed, often hypocritical, and his supposed intellectualism doesn't make him a good person. Brian's political activism is another area where his performative nature becomes obvious. He takes strong stances on issues, attends protests, and lectures others about their political failings. But his activism is shallow and self-serving. He supports causes that make him look good or appeal to women he's trying to impress. When his political positions become inconvenient or unpopular, he abandons them. He uses politics as another form of social signaling rather than genuine commitment to making the world better. The religious hypocrisy is particularly glaring. Brian is an outspoken atheist who mocks religious believers, particularly Christians, for their faith. But Brian's atheism isn't based on careful philosophical reasoning or genuine conviction. It's another way to feel superior to others. When actually challenged on his beliefs or forced to defend his worldview, Brian's arguments are shallow and borrowed from internet atheism rather than serious philosophical thought. Brian's relationship with his own identity as a dog creates interesting tension. Most of the time, he's treated as a human who happens to be a dog. He wears clothes occasionally, drives cars, dates human women, and engages in activities that dogs couldn't normally do. But the show occasionally reminds us that Brian is still a dog. He has dog instincts, enjoys dog activities, and faces limitations and prejudices because of his species. This duality makes Brian's character unique, but also highlights his fundamental outsider status. Over the years, Brian has worked various jobs with limited success. He's been a teacher, briefly, before being fired. He's worked in advertising. He's had stints in various industries, always approaching each new job as if it will be the thing that finally validates him, then becoming disillusioned when the work proves difficult or doesn't provide instant recognition. Brian wants success without effort, recognition without achievement, respect without earning it. The failed writing career haunts everything Brian does. If he could just get published, if his novel could just find an audience, it would validate every choice he's made and prove that his pretensions were justified all along. But as years pass without that breakthrough, Brian has to face the possibility that it will never happen, that he'll remain an unpublished writer forever, that his dream was just a delusion that protected him from confronting his mediocrity. Understanding Brian means recognizing him as a cautionary tale about the dangers of unearned confidence and performative intellectualism. He's smart enough to recognize that Peter is dumb, but not smart enough to realize his own limitations. He's cultured enough to look down on suburban Quahog, but not talented enough to escape it. He wants to be special, important, respected, but he lacks the discipline, talent, or genuine insight to achieve those things through legitimate means. So he fakes it, hoping that if he references enough books and uses enough big words, no one will notice he's as lost and mediocre as everyone else. Brian Griffin is the failed intellectual in all of us who bought our own hype and never delivered on our potential. He's the person who confused intelligence with wisdom, education with insight, and sophistication with depth. He's proof that being able to quote Hemingway doesn't make you a great writer, and that looking down on others doesn't make you better than them. Brian's tragedy is that he could have been so much more if he'd been honest about his limitations and worked to overcome them. But instead, he built an elaborate fiction about who he was and got lost inside it. Glenn Quagmire, known primarily by his last name and his signature catchphrase, "Giggity," is perhaps the most disturbing character in the Family Guy universe when you actually think about what he represents. On the surface, he's played as a comedic sex addict, a swinging bachelor whose constant pursuit of women is treated as a harmless personality quirk. But beneath the comedy lies a character whose behavior ranges from creepy to criminal, whose past is darker than most viewers realize, and who somehow maintains friendships despite being, objectively, a terrible person. Quagmire was born Glenn Quagglechek, later shortening his name to something more manageable. His childhood was deeply traumatic in ways that fundamentally shaped his adult personality and behavior. His father, Dan Quagmire, was secretly transgender, something Glenn didn't discover until decades later when Dan transitioned and became Ida. This revelation came as a profound shock to Quagmire, forcing him to reconsider his entire childhood and his understanding of his family. But the transgender parent wasn't the source of trauma, at least not directly. The real damage came from how Quagmire's mother, Crystal, behaved. Crystal was hypersexual, constantly bringing different men home, exposing young Glenn to adult sexuality far too early. She was neglectful, inappropriate, and created an environment where healthy boundaries about sex and relationships couldn't develop. Glenn grew up watching his mother's chaotic sexual behavior, internalizing toxic messages about women, relationships, and what masculinity should look like. This childhood trauma manifests in Quagmire's adult hypersexuality, his constant pursuit of sexual encounters, his inability to form lasting emotional connections, his objectification of women. All of this traces back to a childhood where sex was everywhere, inappropriate, and disconnected from love or emotional intimacy. Quagmire isn't just a sex addict for comedic purposes. He's a deeply damaged person acting out childhood trauma in ways that harm both himself and others. Quagmire's career as a commercial airline pilot is actually one of the more stable and successful aspects of his life. He's apparently good at his job, maintaining his position for years despite his personal chaos. The career provides him with opportunities to travel, meet women from around the world, and maintain the bachelor lifestyle that defines him. It also provides the income to support his lifestyle and his impressive house in Quahog. The house at 29 Spooner Street, right next to the Griffins, is where Quagmire's darkness becomes most visible. The house contains a sex dungeon in the basement, filled with disturbing equipment and suggesting activities that go beyond consensual adult fun. He has collections of objects that suggest criminal behavior. He's made references to activities that would constitute serious crimes if taken literally. The show plays all of this for comedy, but the implications are horrifying when examined seriously. Quagmire's relationships with women follow a consistent and disturbing pattern. He pursues attractive women aggressively, usually through deception or manipulation. He has sex with them, often through means that questionably constitute consent. Then he immediately loses interest and moves on to the next target. He's incapable of seeing women as complete human beings rather than objects for sexual gratification. Even when women show interest in actual relationships with him, Quagmire can't or won't engage with them as people. There have been rare exceptions. Quagmire has occasionally fallen in love or developed genuine feelings for women. These relationships reveal a different side of his personality, showing capacity for tenderness and actual emotional connection. But invariably, something goes wrong. Sometimes the woman leaves him. Sometimes his own issues sabotage the relationship. Sometimes external circumstances intervene. Quagmire always ends up alone, returning to his pattern of shallow sexual encounters that provide physical satisfaction, but leave him emotionally empty. His friendship with Peter Griffin is genuine despite their very different personalities. Peter is dumb and chaotic, while Quagmire is more intelligent and calculating. But they share a bond built on years of drinking together at the Drunken Clam, going on adventures, and accepting each other's flaws without judgment. Peter doesn't judge Quagmire's sexual behavior, probably because Peter doesn't think deeply enough about anything to recognize how disturbing it is. This non-judgmental acceptance is probably why Quagmire tolerates Peter, despite his stupidity. Quagmire's relationship with Joe Swanson is more complicated. Joe is a cop who theoretically should arrest Quagmire for the various crimes he's implied to have committed. But Joe either doesn't know the full extent of Quagmire's behavior, chooses to ignore it out of friendship, or simply can't believe his friend is capable of the things Quagmire jokes about. This creates an uncomfortable dynamic where law enforcement looks the other way on behavior that would normally result in serious investigation. The relationship with Cleveland was friendly and straightforward, until Quagmire slept with Cleveland's wife, Loretta, destroying Cleveland's marriage. This betrayal showed that Quagmire's sexual compulsions override his friendship loyalty. He knew sleeping with Loretta would devastate Cleveland, but his desire to have sex with her mattered more than protecting his friend. Cleveland eventually forgave Quagmire, or at least accepted his presence in the friend group again, showing either remarkable forgiveness or unhealthy conflict avoidance. But it's Quagmire's relationship with Brian that reveals the most about his character. Quagmire despises Brian with an intensity that seems disproportionate until you hear his reasons. In a famous scene, Quagmire delivers a brutal takedown of Brian's character, listing his pretentiousness, his hypocrisy, his treatment of women, and his unearned superiority. Every criticism is accurate and devastating. But here's the interesting thing. Many of Quagmire's criticisms of Brian also apply to Quagmire himself. Both men treat women terribly. Both are hypocrites. Both have inflated senses of their own importance. The difference is that Brian pretends to be better than he is, while Quagmire embraces his awfulness openly. Quagmire hates Brian not because Brian is worse than him, but because Brian won't admit to being as bad as he is. Quagmire sees his own flaws reflected in Brian, but wrapped in pseudo-intellectual justifications that enrage him. It's the hatred of seeing your own worst traits in someone else who won't acknowledge them. Quagmire's sexual history includes relationships and encounters that range from consensual to clearly criminal. He's dated women far too young for him, crossing lines of appropriateness if not legality. He's used deception to obtain sex, which raises serious consent issues. He's engaged in activities that he describes in ways suggesting lack of consent or coercion. The show plays all of this as comedy, as Quagmire being an outrageous character, but the reality is that Quagmire's behavior describes a sexual predator. His catchphrase, giggity, has become synonymous with sexual excitement and anticipation. He says it constantly, in response to anything that could possibly be interpreted sexually. The phrase is meaningless nonsense, but it's become his signature, the sound that announces Quagmire's presence and his one-track mind. It's played for laughs, but it also reinforces that Quagmire reduces everything to sexual opportunity, unable to interact with the world without filtering it through his compulsions. Quagmire's discovery that his father had transitioned to become Ida was genuinely traumatic for him. The revelation forced him to reconsider his entire childhood and relationship with his father. Quagmire's initial reaction was rejection and disgust, showing prejudices that many viewers found disappointing. But over time, Quagmire has worked to accept Ida, developing a relationship with his parent despite the complexity of the situation. This storyline showed Quagmire capable of growth and acceptance, suggesting more depth than his usual one-note sex obsession. His relationship with his mother Crystal remains troubled. She's still inappropriate, still boundary violating, still treating sex as the most important aspect of existence. Interactions with her make Quagmire uncomfortable because they force him to see where his own issues originated. Crystal is essentially what Quagmire would be if he were female and elderly, and recognizing that connection is disturbing for him. Quagmire has held on to his youth and vitality longer than most of his friends. While Peter has gotten fatter and more slovenly, Joe is paralyzed, and Cleveland has settled into middle-aged comfort. Quagmire has maintained his physical fitness and appearance. This dedication to staying attractive is directly connected to his sexual pursuits. He works out, dresses well, and takes care of himself because his entire identity is built on being sexually appealing and successful with women. The rare moments when Quagmire shows vulnerability or genuine emotion reveal a lonely person underneath the sexual bravado. He lives alone in his big house with his cat James. He has no wife, no children, no lasting romantic partner. His relationships are all shallow encounters that provide momentary satisfaction, but no real connection. His friendships with Peter, Joe, and Cleveland are probably the deepest relationships in his life, which says something about how emotionally isolated he is. Quagmire's military service in the Navy, where he presumably learned to fly, suggests he was once capable of discipline and following rules. But somewhere between his military service and his current life, that discipline eroded or was redirected entirely into sexual pursuits. He's intelligent and capable when he wants to be, but he's chosen to focus all his energy on satisfying his sexual compulsions rather than building a meaningful life. Understanding Quagmire means recognizing him as a deeply damaged person whose trauma has manifested in ways that hurt others. His childhood with Crystal created someone who can't form healthy attachments, who objectifies women because he learned to see sex as disconnected from emotion, and who fills his emptiness with endless conquests that never satisfy. The show plays him as a funny character, but Quagmire is actually tragic. He's trapped in patterns he probably doesn't even recognize as problematic, acting out trauma, and growing older without ever addressing the root causes of his behavior. Glenn Quagmire is proof that you can be successful, physically fit, and socially active while still being profoundly unhappy and unhealthy. His pilot career and active social life mask fundamental emptiness and unresolved psychological damage. He's the warning about what happens when childhood trauma goes unaddressed and sexual compulsion becomes a substitute for genuine human connection. Joseph "Joe" Swanson represents both inspiration and tragedy in the Family Guy universe. He's a police officer paralyzed from the waist down, confined to a wheelchair, yet somehow more physically capable than most able-bodied people in Quahog. He's a devoted husband, trapped in a dysfunctional marriage. He's a hero who saved people's lives, but lost his own mobility in the process. Joe's story is about adapting to catastrophic change, maintaining identity when your body betrays you, and finding ways to stay relevant when everything that defined you has been taken away. Joe was once an elite police officer, the kind of cop other cops admired and criminals feared. He was physically powerful, highly trained in combat and tactics, and fearless in the face of danger. His career was everything to him, defining his identity and giving his life purpose and meaning. Joe was the hero, the protector, the man who ran toward danger while others ran away. His body was his tool and his weapon, finely tuned through years of training and maintained through obsessive dedication to physical fitness. The accident that paralyzed Joe happened during what should have been a routine situation. The exact details have been told slightly differently over the years, but the consistent elements are that Joe was trying to stop a criminal. Something went catastrophically wrong, and Joe fell or was thrown from a significant height. The impact shattered his spine, severing the nerves that controlled his legs and lower body. In an instant, everything Joe was, everything he'd built his identity around, was taken from him. The immediate aftermath was devastating. Joe went from being an elite athlete and police officer to being completely dependent on others for basic functions. He had to relearn how to navigate the world from a wheelchair. He had to accept that his legs would never work again, that the body he'd spent decades perfecting was now permanently damaged. He had to figure out how to be Joe Swanson when being Joe Swanson had always meant being physically powerful and capable. But Joe didn't let the paralysis destroy him. Instead, he adapted in ways that were almost superhuman. He developed his upper body strength to compensate for his useless legs, building muscle mass that made his arms and chest extraordinarily powerful. He maintained his police career, proving that he could still do the job despite his disability. He competed in athletic competitions for people with disabilities, winning medals, and setting records. He refused to let the wheelchair define his limitations. This determination is admirable, but it also reveals Joe's inability to accept his changed circumstances. He pushes himself constantly, trying to prove he's still the man he was before the accident. He takes steroids to maintain his muscle mass, creating mood swings and aggression issues. He puts himself in dangerous situations that might be safer to avoid. He competes obsessively in athletics, as if winning medals could somehow undo what happened to him. Joe's adaptation to disability is impressive, but it's also exhausting and unsustainable. Joe's marriage to Bonnie Swanson is one of the show's most dysfunctional relationships, which is saying something in a show full of terrible marriages. Bonnie has been pregnant for impossibly long periods, a running joke that highlights the show's flexible relationship with time and continuity. But beneath the joke lies a marriage where both partners are deeply unhappy and trapped by circumstances and choices neither knows how to escape. Bonnie stayed with Joe after his accident, which many would consider admirable loyalty. But her decision to stay has led to years of resentment and unhappiness. She's trapped in a marriage with a man whose disability has changed their relationship fundamentally. The physical limitations affect their intimacy, their activities, and their future plans. Bonnie sometimes treats Joe with casual cruelty, making jokes about his paralysis or expressing frustration with his limitations. This behavior suggests she resents him for being disabled, even though she knows intellectually that the accident wasn't his fault. Joe, for his part, knows Bonnie is unhappy, but can't figure out how to fix it. He tries to be a good husband, despite his limitations. He works hard to provide for his family. He participates in family activities as much as he can, but he also knows that he's not the man Bonnie married anymore, and this knowledge eats at him constantly. The paralysis has made him feel like less than a complete man, and Bonnie's behavior reinforces these feelings rather than contradicting them. Their daughter Susie's birth, after that impossibly long pregnancy, added new dimensions to their relationship. Joe loves his daughter and wants to be a good father, but parenting from a wheelchair presents unique challenges. He can't chase after a toddler or carry her upstairs easily. He needs accommodations and assistance for activities that other parents take for granted. This dependence wounds Joe's pride while adding stress to his already strained marriage. Joe's friendship with Peter, Quagmire, and Cleveland provides essential emotional support and normalcy. At the Drunken Clam, Joe is just one of the guys, drinking beer and talking about sports and women and whatever else men discuss when they're avoiding their feelings. His friends don't treat him differently because of his wheelchair, at least not in ways that make him feel diminished. They include him in their schemes and adventures, even when logistics are complicated by his disability. Peter, in particular, treats Joe with a casual acceptance that's probably the best possible response. Peter is too dumb to pity Joe or treat him as fragile. He just sees his friend Joe, who happens to be in a wheelchair. This lack of performative sensitivity might seem callous, but it's actually what Joe needs. He doesn't want people walking on eggshells around him or constantly acknowledging his disability. He wants to be treated like he's still fundamentally the same person he was before the accident. Joe's police work continues despite his paralysis, which raises questions about how exactly this works. The show depicts Joe as still capable of pursuing criminals, getting into fights, and handling dangerous situations. His upper body strength allows him to overpower suspects. He's modified his equipment and techniques to work from a wheelchair. But realistically, There are situations where his disability would be a serious liability, both to himself and his partners. The show glosses over these concerns because addressing them seriously would undermine Joe's character concept. The steroid use is Joe's dark secret, though it's not particularly well hidden. He takes performance-enhancing drugs to maintain his muscle mass and physical capabilities. This steroid use causes mood swings, aggression, and other side effects that affect his behavior and relationships. Joe knows the steroids are harmful, but he can't stop taking them because his entire sense of self-worth is tied to being physically powerful. Without the steroids, he'd lose muscle, become weaker, and have to face the full extent of his limitations. The drugs allow him to maintain the fiction that he's still the man he was before. Joe's participation in the Paralympics and other adaptive sports competitions provides validation and purpose. He's genuinely talented as a wheelchair athlete, winning medals and competing at high levels. These competitions allow Joe to be a hero again, to experience victory and accomplishment, to prove his body is still capable of extraordinary things. But there's something sad about how much Joe needs these victories, how desperately he's clinging to athletic achievement as proof of his worth. The relationship between Joe's disability and his identity is complex and not always healthy. Joe has tied his sense of masculinity and self-worth to physical capability and heroism. When the accident took away his legs, it threatened his entire identity. His response has been to overcompensate, to become even more physically powerful in the ways he can, to prove constantly that the wheelchair doesn't define his limitations. But this exhausting performance of capability prevents Joe from ever truly accepting his changed circumstances and finding peace with his new reality. There have been storylines where Joe temporarily regained the use of his legs through surgery or other interventions. These episodes reveal how much Joe's life revolves around his disability and how his relationships have adapted to it. When he could walk again, Joe became insufferable, treating Bonnie and his friends terribly, becoming arrogant and self-centered. The implication was that Joe's disability had actually made him a better person by forcing humility and gratitude. When that check on his ego was removed, his worst qualities emerged. Joe's relationship with his police partner and the department in general shows an institution trying to accommodate disability while maintaining standards. Joe is allowed to continue working, but there are surely questions about liability and capability that the show doesn't explore seriously. In reality, a paralyzed police officer would face enormous bureaucratic obstacles and might not be cleared for active duty. But Family Guy's Quahog operates on cartoon logic, where Joe can be an effective cop despite obvious limitations. The heroism that defined Joe's identity before the accident still drives him. He still runs toward danger, still volunteers for the most dangerous assignments, still puts himself at risk to protect others. Some of this is genuine courage and commitment to duty, but some of it is probably a death wish, or at least a reckless disregard for his own safety, born from feeling that his life has less value now that he's disabled. Joe acts like he has nothing to lose, because part of him believes that's true. Understanding Joe means recognizing him as a man caught between who he was and who he is, unable to fully grieve the former or accept the latter. His paralysis is the defining fact of his existence, the thing that shapes every aspect of his life, yet he refuses to let it define him. This creates constant tension between acceptance and denial, between adapting to limitations and refusing to acknowledge them. Joe is inspirational in his refusal to give up, but tragic in his inability to find peace with his changed circumstances. Joe Swanson shows us that catastrophic injury doesn't end life, but it does fundamentally change it in ways that can never be fully undone. His story is about survival, adaptation, and the exhausting work of maintaining identity when the body you built that identity on has failed you. He's the hero who saved others but couldn't save himself, now trying to figure out what heroism means when you can't walk toward danger anymore, you can only roll. Cleveland Orenthal Brown is the calm center in a storm of chaos, the voice of reason that no one listens to, and the most genuinely decent person in Peter Griffin's friend group. While Peter is aggressively stupid, Quagmire is a sexual predator, and Joe is fueled by steroids and denial, Cleveland remains patient, kind, and surprisingly well-adjusted, despite living in Quahog and maintaining friendships with people who routinely endanger or betray him. Cleveland's story is about loyalty tested to its breaking point, finding peace after betrayal, and the quiet strength of being the friend who stays calm when everyone else is losing their minds. Cleveland's background before moving to Spooner Street remains somewhat vague, but we know he grew up in Virginia and eventually made his way to Quahog, where he met Peter Griffin and the others who would become his closest friends. Cleveland has always been the most conventionally responsible member of the group. He held steady employment, maintained his home, paid his bills on time, and generally acted like a functioning adult in ways that Peter never managed, and Quagmire never tried to achieve. His first marriage to Loretta Brown seemed solid from the outside, the kind of stable relationship that provided Cleveland with security and normalcy. They had a son together, Cleveland Jr., and built what appeared to be a typical suburban family life. Cleveland worked hard, came home to his family, and participated in the community. He was living the American dream, or at least his version of it, content with a simple life surrounded by friends and family. But that stability was built on foundations that turned out to be far less solid than Cleveland believed. Loretta was unhappy in the marriage, feeling neglected or unfulfilled in ways that Cleveland either didn't notice or didn't know how to address. While Cleveland was at the Drunken Clam with his friends or working at his job, Loretta was at home feeling increasingly dissatisfied with her life and her marriage. This dissatisfaction made her vulnerable to outside attention, particularly from someone who seemed exciting and different from her reliable but boring husband. The revelation that Loretta was having an affair with Quagmire, one of Cleveland's supposed best friends, was devastating on multiple levels. It wasn't just the betrayal by his wife, though that was painful enough. It was the betrayal by Quagmire, someone Cleveland had trusted and considered family. Quagmire knew exactly what he was doing. He knew sleeping with Loretta would destroy Cleveland's marriage and hurt his friend deeply. But Quagmire's sexual compulsions overrode any loyalty or friendship, and he pursued Loretta anyway. Cleveland's response to this double betrayal revealed his character in profound ways. He could have responded with violence or revenge. He could have cut off Quagmire completely and demanded that Peter and Joe choose sides. He could have spiraled into depression or bitterness that poisoned the rest of his life. Instead, Cleveland chose to leave. He packed up his belongings, took his son, and moved back to Virginia to start over. This decision showed both Cleveland's dignity and his emotional intelligence. He recognized that staying in Quahog, seeing Loretta and Quagmire regularly, would be toxic for him and for Cleveland Jr. The years Cleveland spent back in Virginia, the period covered by The Cleveland Show, represented a genuine fresh start. He returned to his hometown, reconnected with old friends, and eventually met Donna Tubbs, a woman with her own children from a previous marriage. Donna was different from Loretta in significant ways. She was more assertive, more independent, and less likely to let Cleveland ignore problems in the relationship. She pushed Cleveland to be more engaged, more present, and more willing to address issues directly rather than avoiding conflict. Cleveland's relationship with Donna's children added complexity to his family life. He became a stepfather to Roberta and Rollo, taking on parenting responsibilities for teenagers and young children who weren't his biological kids. This blended family dynamic required Cleveland to develop new skills and patience. Roberta was a rebellious teenager who didn't initially accept Cleveland's authority. Rollo was a young child with a sharp tongue and attitude that sometimes created conflict. Cleveland had to learn to be a father figure to these children while respecting that he wasn't their biological father, and that their relationship with Donna predated his presence in their lives. When Cleveland eventually returned to Quahog with his new family, he had to face the friends and community he'd left behind. The show doesn't deeply explore the emotional complexity of this return, but it must have been difficult. Cleveland had to see Quagmire again, the man who destroyed his first marriage. He had to reconnect with Peter, Joe, and the others who'd remained friends with Quagmire throughout. He had to reestablish himself in a community where everyone knew about his public humiliation. But Cleveland's return also showed his capacity for forgiveness and moving forward. He didn't hold grudges or demand apologies. He simply came back, resumed his friendships, and integrated his new family into the Quahog community. This grace and maturity set Cleveland apart from most of the other characters, who tend to hold on to resentments and escalate conflicts rather than resolving them. Cleveland's role in the friend group has always been as the voice of reason and caution. When Peter proposes some idiotic scheme, Cleveland is usually the one pointing out why it won't work or why it's dangerous. When the group is about to do something illegal or harmful, Cleveland expresses concern or tries to talk them out of it. His catchphrase of saying, "No, no, 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 no," while being dragged into whatever chaos Peter has created perfectly captures his role. He knows better, he objects, but he ultimately goes along because that's what friendship requires. This pattern of Cleveland objecting, but ultimately participating, reveals something interesting about his character. Cleveland has better judgment than his friends, recognizing danger and stupidity that they miss. But he values friendship and loyalty enough to go along with their plans anyway, even when he knows they'll end badly. This loyalty is admirable but also enabling. Cleveland's presence and participation gives Peter's schemes legitimacy they don't deserve. If Cleveland, the smart, reasonable one, is going along with the plan, maybe it's not as crazy as it seems. Cleveland's personality is notably calmer and more even-tempered than his friends. While Peter is manic, Quagmire is predatory, and Joe is aggressive, Cleveland maintains a steady emotional baseline. He doesn't have explosive outbursts or dramatic mood swings. He processes his emotions internally and responds to situations with measured consideration rather than immediate reaction. This emotional stability makes Cleveland a grounding presence in a group that might otherwise spiral into complete chaos. His career has been relatively stable compared to Peter's constant job changes. Cleveland has worked various blue-collar jobs over the years, showing up reliably and performing his duties competently. He's not ambitious in the way that might drive someone to climb corporate ladders or start their own business. He's content with honest work that pays the bills and allows him to support his family. This lack of ambition isn't laziness. It's satisfaction with a simple life and priorities that center on family and friends, rather than wealth or status. Cleveland's relationship with his son Cleveland Jr. has evolved significantly over the years. Jr. went from being a relatively normal kid to becoming extremely obese and socially awkward after the move to Virginia. This dramatic change was never adequately explained, but it created new challenges for Cleveland as a father. He had to worry about Junior's health, his social development, and his future prospects while trying not to shame or hurt his son in the process. Cleveland's patience and acceptance of Junior, despite these challenges, showed his capacity for unconditional love. The friendship between Cleveland and Peter is probably Cleveland's most significant relationship outside his family. They've known each other for years, shared countless experiences, and maintained their bond through Cleveland's divorce, his move to Virginia, and his return to Quahog. Peter is objectively a terrible friend in many ways. He's selfish, inconsiderate, and regularly puts Cleveland in danger or uncomfortable situations. But there's genuine affection between them, and Cleveland seems to understand that Peter's heart is usually in the right place, even when his brain emphatically is not. Cleveland's patience with Peter's stupidity is remarkable. When Peter does something catastrophically dumb, which happens constantly, Cleveland doesn't abandon the friendship or even get particularly angry. He sighs, shakes his head, and helps clean up the mess. This patience suggests either extraordinary forgiveness or possibly a recognition that Peter can't really help being who he is, and expecting him to change is futile. The relationship with Joe is more straightforward friendship without the complicated history Cleveland has with Peter and Quagmire. Joe and Cleveland seem to genuinely enjoy each other's company without the tensions that exist elsewhere in the group. They bond over sports, family life, and shared experiences navigating the challenges of being responsible adults in a friendship group that often acts like teenagers. Cleveland's presence in the group serves an important function beyond just being the voice of reason. He's the conscience, the one who occasionally forces the others to consider whether what they're doing is actually right or good. When they're planning something particularly cruel or harmful, Cleveland's discomfort or objections serve as a mirror showing them their own moral failings. They usually ignore him and proceed anyway, but at least Cleveland made them acknowledge what they were doing. Understanding Cleveland means recognizing him as the friend who endures, who shows up consistently, who provides stability in a chaotic environment. He's been betrayed, humiliated, and put in danger repeatedly, yet he maintains his friendships and his basic decency. He's proof that you can be a good person while still being friends with problematic people, though whether that's admirable loyalty or problematic enabling probably depends on your perspective. Cleveland Brown is ultimately a study in patience, forgiveness, and the sometimes exhausting work of being the reasonable person in a group of unreasonable people. He's the friend who stays calm when everyone else is panicking, who thinks things through when others act impulsively, and who picks up the pieces when everything inevitably falls apart. He's not flashy or dramatic, but he's essential. Without Cleveland's stabilizing presence, the friend group would probably have self-destructed years ago, and Quahog would be even more chaotic than it already is. Quahog, Rhode Island isn't just the Griffin family and their immediate circle of friends. The town is populated by dozens of recurring characters who add color, chaos, and bizarre authenticity to this animated universe. From the criminally incompetent mayor to the revenge-obsessed giant chicken, from the predatory elderly neighbor to the mysterious greased-up deaf guy, these supporting characters create a rich tapestry that makes Quahog feel like a real place, albeit a deeply disturbed one. Understanding these characters means understanding the world the Griffins inhabit and the community that somehow tolerates their endless chaos. Mayor Adam West is perhaps Quahog's most prominent supporting character, and his presence explains a lot about why the town functions the way it does. Adam West, playing a fictionalized version of himself, serves as Quahog's mayor despite being completely insane. He believes in conspiracy theories, has conversations with inanimate objects, makes policy decisions based on fever dreams and paranoid delusions, and generally runs the town like a lunatic with unchecked power. The fact that Adam West keeps getting reelected says something profound about Quahog's citizens and their relationship with governance. Mayor West's backstory is a bizarre mixture of his real acting career, particularly his iconic role as Batman in the 1960s television series, and completely fictional elements created for the show. He references his Batman past occasionally, using it as qualification for various mayoral decisions, despite the obvious lack of connection between playing a superhero on TV and running a municipality. His mayoral initiatives include outlawing flutes because he believes they attract snakes, installing a revolving door at the mall that goes too fast, and various other policies that demonstrate complete disconnect from reality or civic responsibility. The mayor's personal life is equally bizarre. He lives alone in a mansion where he conducts strange experiments, hosts imaginary dinner parties, and engages in activities that suggest serious mental health issues that go completely unaddressed. He has no apparent staff, advisors, or family members who might intervene in his increasingly erratic behavior. He's completely isolated in his delusions, and the town just accepts this as normal because it's always been this way. When Adam West, the actor, passed away in 2017, the show faced a decision about how to handle Mayor West's character. They chose to kill off the character as well, giving Mayor West a send-off that acknowledged both the character's importance to the show and the actor's contribution. His death created a power vacuum in Quahog's leadership that was eventually filled, but Mayor West's bizarre legacy continues to influence how the town operates. Tom Tucker and Diane Simmons represent Quahog's media landscape, anchoring the local news at Channel 5. Tom Tucker is a vain, self-absorbed news anchor who cares more about his appearance and celebrity status than actual journalism. He has a glass eye that occasionally pops out at inappropriate moments. He's had numerous affairs and scandals, and he treats the news as entertainment rather than information. Tom's son, Jake Tucker, has his face upside down, a condition that Tom refuses to acknowledge or discuss, showing his capacity for denial about uncomfortable realities. Diane Simmons was Tom's co-anchor for years, maintaining a professional relationship that masked deep resentment and murderous rage. Diane's backstory revealed her as a woman whose youth and beauty had defined her value in television news, and as she aged, she became increasingly bitter about being overlooked and undervalued. This bitterness eventually transformed into homicidal fury, leading to a storyline where Diane murdered several people and attempted to kill others before being killed herself. Her death was shocking because it took a character who'd been comic relief and revealed genuine darkness underneath. The Tucker-Simmons dynamic perfectly captured toxic workplace relationships and the particular cruelty of an industry that values women primarily for their appearance and discards them as they age. Diane's descent into murder was played for dark comedy, but it was also a surprisingly pointed critique of how media treats aging women and how that treatment can destroy people psychologically. Joyce Kinney replaced Diane Simmons after her death, bringing her own complications to the news desk. Joyce had history with Lois Griffin from high school, history that involved betrayal and cruelty. When Joyce discovered that Lois had appeared in an adult film years earlier, she aired the story on the news, destroying Lois's reputation in the community purely for ratings and personal revenge. This storyline showed how Quahog's media operates without ethics or concern for the people whose lives they affect. Herbert, the elderly pedophile who lives near the Griffins, is perhaps the show's most controversial recurring character. Herbert is clearly and explicitly sexually attracted to young boys, particularly Chris Griffin. He watches Chris through binoculars, makes inappropriate comments, and actively tries to get Chris into situations where he'd be alone with him. The show plays this for comedy, treating Herbert as a harmless old pervert whose attraction to children is a quirky character trait rather than a serious threat. In reality, Herbert's behavior describes a predatory pedophile who should be on a registry and kept away from children. The fact that Chris's parents don't seem particularly concerned about their elderly neighbor's obvious sexual interest in their son is absurd even by Family Guy standards. Herbert is allowed to exist in the community, interact with children, and continue his predatory behavior without any consequences or intervention. This normalization of pedophilia for comedy purposes is one of the show's more indefensible choices. Herbert's character does have some depth beyond the pedophilia. He's a war veteran with a difficult past. He has a dog named Jessie that he loves deeply, and he has genuine friendships with other elderly residents of Quahog. These humanizing details don't excuse his predatory behavior, but they do make him a more complete character than just a one-note joke about child molestation. The greased-up deaf guy is one of Quahog's most inexplicable residents. He's exactly what his name suggests. A deaf man who covers himself in grease and runs around naked or nearly naked, evading police and causing public disturbances. His deafness means he can't hear people yelling at him to stop or put on clothes. His grease covering makes him impossible to catch because he slips out of any attempted grasp. He appears periodically throughout the series, running through scenes while people shout ineffectively after him. The greased-up deaf guy represents the kind of absurdist humor that Family Guy does well. There's no explanation for why he does what he does, no backstory to humanize him, no deeper meaning to discover. He's just a recurring element of chaos in Quahog's landscape, a reminder that this town operates by different rules than normal reality. The fact that he's never successfully caught or stopped suggests that Quahog's institutions are fundamentally unable to handle even minor ongoing disturbances. Consuela, the Griffin's cleaning lady, represents the show's complicated relationship with race and ethnicity. She's a Hispanic immigrant with broken English, played as a stereotype for comedy purposes. Her character revolves around a few repeated catchphrases, particularly no, and her obsessive hoarding of lemons and cleaning supplies. She's not given much depth or complexity, existing primarily as an ethnic joke that wouldn't be acceptable in most modern television. Dr. Elmer Hartman is Quahog's primary physician, and his incredible medical incompetence explains why so many characters survive injuries that should kill them, while others die from minor conditions. Dr. Hartman misdiagnoses conditions constantly, performs unnecessary procedures, and generally practices medicine with a cavalier attitude toward patient safety or medical science. He's enthusiastic and seemingly well-meaning, but he's also dangerously unqualified for his position. The fact that Dr. Hartman maintains his medical license and practice despite countless malpractice incidents says something about Quahog's regulatory environment and institutional oversight. There are apparently no consequences for medical incompetence in this town, no board reviewing patient outcomes or investigating suspicious deaths. Dr. Hartman just continues practicing medicine, harming patients, and collecting fees without anyone stopping him. Mort Goldman runs the pharmacy in Quahog, providing medication and medical supplies to the community while dealing with anxiety, hypochondria, and a generally neurotic personality. Mort's character trades on Jewish stereotypes, from his anxious personality to his profession to his relationship with his mother. He's frequently the target of anti-Semitic jokes from other characters, particularly Peter, who seems oblivious to how offensive his comments are. Mort's wife Muriel was killed in a tragic accident, leaving Mort a widower raising his son Neil alone. This traumatic loss added depth to Mort's character, showing genuine grief beneath the comic neuroses. His later remarriage to a Christian woman created new comedy around interfaith relationships and religious differences, though the show's treatment of these themes was typically superficial and played for easy jokes rather than genuine exploration. The giant chicken, whose real name is Ernie, has an inexplicable blood feud with Peter Griffin that results in elaborate, destructive fight sequences throughout the series. Their rivalry began over an expired coupon, an absurdly minor slight that escalated into a multi-decade war of violence and revenge. Every few episodes, Peter and the giant chicken encounter each other and immediately launch into extended fight. Sequences that destroy property, endanger bystanders, and cause massive amounts of collateral damage. These fights are spectacular in their destruction and creativity, taking the characters through multiple locations and building types, incorporating whatever elements are nearby into the combat, and generally treating Quahog as a playground for their personal vendetta. The fact that both Peter and the chicken survive these encounters, which should absolutely kill them multiple times over, demonstrates the show's cartoon logic about violence and consequences. Carl and his wife, who rarely speaks, are recurring background characters who appear in various episodes without much development or backstory. They seem to exist primarily to occasionally comment on the main character's actions, or to fill crowd scenes where familiar faces are needed. Their lack of characterization is actually notable in a show where even minor characters usually get some defining traits or running jokes. Bruce is Quahog's most prominent LGBTQ character, an effeminate gay man who works various service jobs around town and speaks with an exaggerated lisp and mannerisms. Bruce's character trades on gay stereotypes for comedy purposes, though he's generally portrayed as kind, competent at his jobs, and more well-adjusted than many of Quahog's straight residents. He's one of the few openly gay characters in Quahog who faces no apparent discrimination or harassment, suggesting the town is oddly progressive on LGBTQ issues, despite being regressive in many other ways. Angela is Peter's African-American coworker at the Pawtucket Brewery, who appears occasionally when workplace scenes are needed. She's been characterized as somewhat promiscuous and is usually portrayed as annoyed by Peter's behavior, which is a reasonable response to working with Peter Griffin. Her character hasn't been developed much beyond being a recognizable face at Peter's workplace and an occasional participant in workplace storylines. The town of Quahog itself is populated by dozens of other recurring characters who appear less frequently but add texture to the world. There are shopkeepers, police officers, teachers, students at the high school, and various professionals who keep the town functioning despite the chaos the main characters create. Many of these characters are defined by single traits or jokes: the sex-crazed pharmacist, the incompetent teacher, the corrupt cop, the perverted priest. What's interesting about Quahog's supporting cast is how they create a functional community, despite being almost universally incompetent, corrupt, or disturbed. The mayor is insane, the doctor is incompetent, the news media is unethical, and various predators operate openly without consequences. Yet somehow, the town continues functioning, businesses stay open, and people mostly go about their lives without everything collapsing into chaos. This suggests either remarkable resilience or simply that Quahog's standards are so low that what would be catastrophic dysfunction anywhere else is just normal Tuesday here. The supporting characters of Quahog serve an important narrative function beyond just adding color to the background. They're the mirror that reflects back how insane the main character's behavior is. When Peter does something ridiculous, the supporting cast's reactions help calibrate how we should interpret it. They provide context, consequences, and occasionally justice when the main characters go too far. They're the world that the Griffins live in and affect, the community that somehow tolerates their presence despite having every reason to exile them. Understanding Quahog's supporting cast means understanding that the Griffins don't exist in isolation. They're part of a larger ecosystem of dysfunction, where everyone is damaged in their own way, where institutions have failed at basic functions, and where the only thing holding society together is inertia and the shared delusion that this is all somehow normal. The supporting characters aren't just background decoration. They're evidence that Quahog's problems run much deeper than one chaotic family, and that the entire town might need serious intervention that it will never receive. Every universe needs its villains, and Family Guy has cultivated a rogues gallery of antagonists, ranging from the genuinely threatening to the absurdly petty. These aren't typical cartoon villains with elaborate plans for world domination. They're deeply personal enemies, motivated by grudges, jealousy, greed, and in one case, an expired coupon. Understanding the villains and antagonists of Family Guy means understanding how conflict works in this universe, where the greatest threats often come not from evil masterminds, but from ordinary people pushed to extremes by their worst impulses. Carter Pewterschmidt, Lois's father, stands as perhaps the most consistently antagonistic presence in the Griffin family's life. Carter isn't a villain in the traditional sense. He's not trying to destroy the world or commit crimes, at least not in ways he'd be prosecuted for. But he's absolutely an antagonist, particularly toward Peter, whom he views as the greatest mistake his daughter ever made. Carter's antagonism stems from genuine beliefs about class, worth, and what his daughter deserved. He thinks Lois married beneath herself, and he's spent decades making sure Peter knows it. Carter's wealth gives him enormous power that he wields without conscience or concern for who gets hurt. He's destroyed businesses, ruined careers, and casually inflicted suffering on countless people in pursuit of profit or competitive advantage. He's a robber baron in the old American tradition, someone who believes wealth equals worth, and that being rich gives you the right to treat others as disposable resources. His treatment of Peter isn't unique. It's just how Carter treats everyone he considers beneath him, which is almost everyone. What makes Carter particularly dangerous is that he's not stupid or incompetent like many of Family Guy's antagonists. He's intelligent, connected, and ruthless. When he wants to make someone's life difficult, he has the resources and knowledge to do it effectively. He's bought politicians, manipulated markets, and used his media ownership to shape public opinion. He's the kind of villain who operates within legal boundaries while doing things that are morally indefensible, protected by wealth and influence from consequences ordinary people would face. Carter's relationship with Lois is complicated by genuine paternal love, mixed with disappointment and control. He loves his daughter, but can't accept her choices or respect her autonomy. He wants Lois to be happy, but only in ways he approves of, following a life plan he's designed. When Lois defies him, as she did by marrying Peter, Carter responds with financial punishment and ongoing emotional manipulation. He'll help his daughter when she's in crisis, but he'll never stop reminding her that she brought her problems on herself by marrying poorly. Barbara Pewterschmidt is less overtly antagonistic than her husband, but she's still a source of ongoing pain for Lois. Barbara's weapon is disappointment rather than direct attack. She expresses regret about Lois's choices through sighs, pointed comments, and comparisons to what Lois's life could have been. She's mastered the art of making someone feel terrible while maintaining plausible deniability about causing harm. Barbara never directly insults Peter or Lois's life choices. She just makes observations about how different things are from what she'd hoped, and those observations cut deeper than any direct insult. Ernie the Giant Chicken, as mentioned earlier, maintains a blood feud with Peter Griffin that has resulted in some of the show's most spectacular destruction. What began as a dispute over an expired coupon has escalated into attempted murder on both sides, with neither Peter nor Ernie willing to let the grudge go, despite multiple opportunities to end their conflict peacefully. The Giant Chicken isn't trying to take over the world or hurt innocent people. He just wants to kill Peter Griffin, and he's willing to destroy half of Quahog in pursuit of that goal. The absurdity of their conflict is the point. These extended fight sequences demonstrate how masculine pride and refusal to back down can escalate trivial disputes into existential warfare. Neither Peter nor Ernie can even remember exactly how their feud started at this point. They just know they hate each other, and that their conflict has taken on its own momentum. They've tried to make peace several times, but the grudge always reignites, usually because one of them does something the other interprets as disrespectful or aggressive. The fights themselves are spectacular showcases of animated violence, taking Peter and Ernie through buildings, vehicles, natural disasters, and whatever else the animators can imagine. They punch each other through walls, throw each other off buildings, and generally inflict damage that should kill both of them multiple times over. The fact that they both survive these encounters, dust themselves off, and go about their lives until the next meeting demonstrates the show's cartoon logic about consequences and mortality. Bertram is Stewie's half-brother and arch-nemesis, created from one of Peter's sperm donations years before Stewie's birth. Bertram is essentially Stewie's equal in intelligence and ambition, making him one of the few characters who can match Stewie intellectually and technologically. Their rivalry stems from both personal animosity and existential threat. Bertram wants to prevent his own erasure from history, while Stewie sees Bertram as a competitor for his unique genius status and a genuine threat to his existence. The conflict between Stewie and Bertram has taken them through time and space, with both deploying advanced technology and temporal manipulation in their attempts to destroy each other. Unlike the Peter-Ernie conflict, which is based on stupid masculine pride, the Stewie-Bertram rivalry has actual stakes. They're fighting over existence itself, over who gets to survive and shape history. Their battles are intellectual chess matches with real consequences, even if those consequences are usually reversed by time travel or cartoon logic. Bertram represents what Stewie might have become if circumstances had been slightly different, a dark mirror showing Stewie his own potential for villainy. Where Stewie has evolved toward genuine emotion and connection, particularly with Brian, Bertram remains purely focused on power and dominance. He has no meaningful relationships, no emotional growth, no arc beyond his conflict with Stewie. He's what Stewie was in early seasons before character development made him more complex and sympathetic. Death himself appears as a recurring character in Family Guy, though whether he qualifies as a villain is debatable. Death is just doing his job, collecting souls when their time comes, but he's been cast as an antagonist when that job involves collecting people the Griffins care about, or when characters try to cheat Death through various means. Death is portrayed as overworked, underappreciated, and somewhat incompetent at his eternal responsibilities. The Griffin family's various encounters with Death have revealed him as more bureaucrat than villain. He follows rules, maintains schedules, and gets frustrated when people make his job harder through resistance or technicalities. He's taken Peter, tried to collect Brian, and appeared in various other circumstances when mortality intersects with the Griffin family story. His relationship with the family is almost friendly, built on familiarity from repeated interactions, rather than fear or hostility. Various ex-girlfriends and jilted lovers have served as temporary antagonists throughout the series. People whom Peter, Brian, or other characters have wronged romantically, sometimes return seeking revenge or causing problems for the family. These antagonists are usually one-episode threats, but they highlight how the main character's relationship failures create ongoing consequences that occasionally resurface at inconvenient times. The evil monkey who lived in Chris's closet was positioned as an antagonist for years before being revealed as actually a decent guy who'd been driven to his closet dwelling by his own failed marriage and life disappointments. The evil monkey's transformation from mysterious threat to sympathetic character showed how perception shapes antagonism. Chris saw him as evil because he couldn't understand the monkey's situation. Once they communicated, and Chris learned the monkey's story, the antagonism disappeared, and they became friends. This storyline demonstrated Family Guy's occasional interest in subverting antagonist expectations and showing how misunderstanding creates conflict. The evil monkey wasn't really evil. He was just a regular monkey dealing with divorce and depression by hiding in a child's closet and making threatening gestures. It's weird, but it's not villainous. His redemption showed that sometimes the monsters we fear are just damaged people, or monkeys, acting out their pain. James Woods appears as himself in various episodes, usually positioned as an antagonist to the Griffin family. The real James Woods is an actor known for his conservative politics and social media presence. Family Guy's version of James Woods is portrayed as vain, petty, and willing to engage in elaborate revenge schemes over minor slights. When Peter uses James Woods' identity, Woods retaliates by seducing and embarrassing Peter. When the Griffins cross Woods in various ways, he responds with disproportionate vengeance. The James Woods episodes play with celebrity and how famous people might react to being mocked or inconvenienced by ordinary people. Woods has the resources and narcissism to turn minor conflicts into major problems for the Griffins. He represents a particular type of antagonist, the powerful person who treats challenges to their ego as existential threats, requiring maximum retaliation. Various government agencies and officials have served as antagonists when the Griffin family's chaos intersects with law enforcement or regulatory bodies. Child Protective Services has investigated the family multiple times for their obviously terrible parenting. The IRS has come after Peter for tax issues. Police have arrested various family members for their crimes. These institutional antagonists represent society's attempts to impose order and consequences on the Griffins, attempts that usually fail because cartoon logic protects the family from permanent consequences. The chicken who attacks Peter's car in one episode, leading to another extended fight sequence, shows how Family Guy creates antagonists from the most mundane circumstances. A chicken crosses the road. Peter doesn't stop. The chicken takes it personally. And suddenly, there's a new blood feud that requires resolution through violence. The ease with which ordinary situations escalate into life-or-death conflict in Quahog suggests something deeply wrong with the town's culture and how its residents process conflict. Diane Simmons, before her death, transformed from supporting character to murderous antagonist in one of the show's darker turns. Her killing spree was motivated by aging out of relevance in broadcast news and romantic rejection, showing how professional and personal disappointment can curdle into homicidal rage. Diane's antagonism was genuinely threatening because she was smart, had nothing to lose, and was willing to kill anyone who got in her way. Her death ended the immediate threat, but demonstrated that seemingly stable people can become dangerous when pushed past their breaking point. Various bullies at school serve as antagonists to Meg and Chris, representing the social hierarchies and casual cruelties of adolescence. These antagonists aren't particularly developed or interesting, but they create the hostile environment that shapes the Griffin children's school experiences. The fact that teachers and administrators don't intervene in obvious bullying suggests institutional failure that allows antagonism to flourish unchecked. The antagonists of Family Guy aren't traditional villains with evil plans and obvious motivations. They're people motivated by grudges, wounded pride, professional jealousy, class resentment, and the thousand small ways that humans hurt each other and escalate conflicts. Carter Pewterschmidt is a villain because of his classism and control. The giant chicken is an antagonist because of masculine inability to let grudges go. Bertram is an enemy because of existential competition. Death is an antagonist simply by doing his job. What makes Family Guy's antagonists interesting is how they reflect the show's themes about how ordinary people become enemies. It's not about good versus evil or heroes versus villains. It's about how stupid grudges escalate, how class conflict poisons relationships, how professional disappointment turns to violence, and how the refusal to back down or forgive transforms minor conflicts into major warfare. The villains and antagonists of Family Guy are us at our worst, our most petty, our most vindictive, our most unable to let things go and move forward. They're proof that you don't need elaborate evil plans to ruin lives. Sometimes all it takes is wounded pride, expired coupons, and an unwillingness to be the bigger person and walk away. Quahog, Rhode Island is more than just a setting for Family Guy. It's a character in its own right, a living, breathing community with its own history, culture, and deeply dysfunctional identity. This fictional town represents a particular slice of American life. The working-class New England, community that's seen better days, where institutions barely function, where everyone knows everyone else's business, and where the mundane and the absurd exist side by side without anyone finding that particularly remarkable. Understanding Quahog means understanding the world that shaped the Griffins and continues to enable their chaos. Quahog is located in Rhode Island, America's smallest state, positioned somewhere along the coast based on various references to beaches and ocean access. The exact location shifts depending on what the plot requires, but it's consistently portrayed as a small city or large town, big enough to have urban amenities like television stations and municipal buildings, small enough that people run into each other constantly and everyone has some degree of social connection. It's the kind of place where you can't go to the grocery store without seeing someone you know, for better or worse. The town's founding goes back to colonial times, with various references to its early history, suggesting it was established by settlers who were probably escaping religious persecution or looking for economic opportunities, like most New England towns. Over the centuries, Quahog developed the typical industries of coastal Rhode Island communities: fishing, shipping, some light manufacturing. By the time the show takes place, most of these traditional industries have declined or disappeared, leaving Quahog as a post-industrial community trying to figure out what comes next. The Pawtucket Brewery represents one of Quahog's major remaining employers, producing beer that's distributed regionally and providing jobs for residents like Peter Griffin. The brewery's survival in an era of corporate consolidation and craft beer competition is somewhat miraculous, suggesting either excellent business management or the show's flexible relationship with economic reality. The brewery's presence shapes Quahog's culture, making beer central to social life and providing an anchor industry that keeps the local economy from complete collapse. Spooner Street, where the Griffins, Swansons, and Browns live, represents typical middle-class Quahog residential life. The houses are modest two-story structures built probably in the mid-20th century, affordable on working-class salaries, but nothing fancy. The street has sidewalks, trees, and a neighborhood dynamic where people know their neighbors and interact regularly. It's the kind of street where kids can play outside, where people borrow tools from each other, and where everyone knows about everyone else's drama. The Drunken Clam is Quahog's most important social institution, at least for the male characters who spend considerable time there. This dive bar serves cheap beer, shows sports on television, and provides a space where working-class men can gather without judgment or expectation. The Clam isn't fancy. It's dark, probably slightly dirty, and certainly not the kind of place that tourists would seek out. But it's authentic, comfortable, and essential to Quahog's social fabric. Horace runs the bar, serving drinks and tolerating his customers' nonsense with weary patience. The bar represents a particular kind of American institution that's been disappearing from many communities. The local watering hole where regulars gather, where bartenders know everyone's names and usual orders, where friendships are maintained and deals are made. The Drunken Clam is where Peter, Quagmire, Joe, and Cleveland process their lives, celebrate victories, and commiserate over defeats. It's their sanctuary from family obligations, work stress, and the general difficulty of existence. James Woods Regional High School educates Quahog's teenagers, including Meg and Chris Griffin. The school is named after actor James Woods, who presumably donated money or had some connection that resulted in the naming rights. The school appears to be typical of American public high schools: underfunded, overcrowded, staffed by teachers who range from dedicated to completely checked out. The academic standards are apparently low, given that Chris continues to pass grades despite being barely literate. The school's social dynamics mirror typical high school hierarchies, with popular kids at the top, outcasts at the bottom, and most students somewhere in between trying to survive adolescence. Bullying appears to be rampant and largely unaddressed by administration. The school's sports teams exist but aren't particularly successful. The overall impression is of an institution going through the motions of education without much actual learning or growth happening. Quahog's government is centered around City Hall, where Mayor Adam West conducted his insane administration for years. The building itself is typical of municipal architecture: imposing, slightly run down, filled with bureaucrats doing minimal work. The various departments, from planning to sanitation to law enforcement, appear to function at barely adequate levels. Corruption seems normalized rather than scandalized. Incompetence is standard rather than exceptional. The Quahog Police Department, where Joe Swanson works, demonstrates the town's approach to law enforcement: reactive rather than proactive, often incompetent, and selective about which laws they actually enforce. Serious crimes sometimes go uninvestigated, while minor infractions receive disproportionate attention. The department seems understaffed and under-resourced, relying on officers like Joe who continue working despite serious disabilities because the department can't afford to be picky about personnel. Channel 5 News, anchored first by Tom Tucker and Diane Simmons, and later by other personalities, represents Quahog's media landscape. The news coverage is sensationalistic, focusing on local human interest stories and scandals rather than serious journalism. The station's approach to news treats everything as entertainment, prioritizing ratings over accuracy or public service. This media environment shapes how Quahog residents understand their community and the wider world, filtering everything through local gossip and superficial coverage. The Quahog Mall represents commercial life in the town, providing shopping and entertainment options for residents. Like many American malls, it's probably past its prime, with vacant storefronts and declining foot traffic as online shopping and changing retail patterns affect brick-and-mortar businesses. But it remains a gathering place, particularly for teenagers who need somewhere to hang out that isn't home or school. Goldman's Pharmacy, run by Mort Goldman, serves the community's medical supply needs while also functioning as a social space where people pick up prescriptions and gossip. The pharmacy represents small business survival in an era of chain drugstores and corporate consolidation. Mort's ability to keep his independent pharmacy operating suggests either exceptional business acumen or Quahog's resistance to chain store domination. The Clam's Dig restaurant, occasionally mentioned but less prominently featured than the Drunken Clam, represents Quahog's dining options. Nothing fancy, probably seafood-focused, given the coastal location, affordable for working-class families. Quahog's restaurant scene appears limited, suggesting a community where people mostly eat at home and dining out is an occasional treat rather than regular occurrence. Quahog's beaches provide recreation and connection to the ocean that defines much of Rhode Island's identity. The beaches appear public and accessible, crowded during summer months with residents seeking relief from heat and routine. Beach culture shapes Quahog's seasonal rhythms, with summer bringing tourists and activity, while winter sees the town turn inward. The town's economy is clearly struggling, built on declining industries without obvious replacement sectors emerging. The brewery provides some employment. Retail and service jobs employ others. But there's a sense of economic stagnation, of a community that had better days in the past and isn't sure what its future looks like. Housing is affordable because demand is limited. Jobs exist, but don't pay particularly well. It's the classic post-industrial American town story. Demographically, Quahog appears predominantly white, with minority populations that include African American, Asian, and Hispanic residents. The show's handling of racial and ethnic diversity has been controversial, often trading in stereotypes for comedy rather than depicting authentic multicultural community. The demographic makeup suggests a town that's less diverse than many American communities, but not completely homogeneous. The religious landscape includes Catholic and Protestant churches that serve portions of the community, though religious observance doesn't seem particularly strong or central to most residents' lives. Peter was raised Catholic and occasionally references this background, but his actual practice is minimal. The presence of Jewish residents like the Goldmans suggests some religious diversity, though the show's treatment of religion is usually superficial or mocking. Quahog's relationship with neighboring Providence, Rhode Island's capital and largest city, positions it as a smaller community in the orbit of a larger urban center. Providence provides employment, entertainment, and services that Quahog lacks, while Quahog offers more affordable housing and slower pace of life. Many residents probably commute to Providence for work while living in Quahog to raise families or escape urban intensity. The town celebrates various holidays and events that bring the community together. 4th of July with fireworks, Christmas with decorations and festivities, and various local celebrations unique to Quahog. These events reveal community spirit beneath the dysfunction, moments when residents come together and remember they're part of something larger than their individual struggles. Quahog's infrastructure is aging and inadequate, with frequent references to roads needing repair, utilities failing, and public services stretched thin. The town can't afford major capital improvements, so everything slowly deteriorates until crisis forces action. This infrastructure decay reflects broader patterns in American communities, where decades of disinvestment have created maintenance backlogs that feel insurmountable. The town's relationship with crime is complicated. Serious crimes occur, but they're treated almost casually by residents who've normalized a certain level of violence and chaos. The police respond when called, but don't seem particularly effective at preventing crime or catching criminals. There's a sense that everyone's just trying to get by, and if that means tolerating some crime and corruption, so be it. Quahog schools, beyond the high school, include elementary and middle schools that serve younger children. These institutions appear similarly underfunded and struggling, staffed by teachers who care but lack resources to be truly effective. Education quality is probably mediocre at best, preparing students for working-class employment rather than professional careers or higher education. The town's medical facilities include Quahog General Hospital, where Dr. Hartman practices his incompetent medicine, and various specialist clinics and practices. Healthcare access seems adequate for routine needs, but probably inadequate for serious conditions that require specialized care. Residents with serious medical issues likely travel to Providence or Boston for treatment. Quahog's cultural life is limited, but present. There are occasional theatrical productions, music performances, and art exhibitions, though these aren't prominently featured in the show. The community probably has more cultural resources than it gets credit for, filled with people pursuing creative interests despite lack of institutional support or public attention. What makes Quahog fascinating as a setting is how it normalizes dysfunction while maintaining enough functionality for daily life to continue. The mayor is insane, but the garbage still gets picked up. The police are incompetent, but people mostly don't get murdered. The schools are terrible, but kids still graduate. The economy is struggling, but people find ways to survive. Quahog represents American resilience and adaptation, communities that keep functioning despite everything suggesting they should collapse. The town's tolerance for the Griffin family's endless chaos says something profound about Quahog's character. Any normal community would have exiled Peter Griffin years ago. His behavior endangers people, destroys property, and creates constant problems. But Quahog just absorbs the chaos, cleans up the mess, and moves on. This tolerance might be admirable flexibility, or might be dysfunction so deep that nothing surprises anyone anymore. Understanding Quahog means recognizing it as a microcosm of post-industrial American communities, struggling economically, declining demographically, maintaining traditions while uncertain about the future, filled with people trying to build decent lives despite systemic failures and limited opportunities. It's not a terrible place to live, but it's not particularly great either. It's just home, with all the comfort and frustration that word implies. Quahog is where the Griffins belong because nowhere else would tolerate them, and that says everything about both the family and the town. Family Guy has never been content to stay within the boundaries of its suburban sitcom premise. Over its 2-decade run, the show has ventured into alternate universes, traveled through time, parodied entire film franchises, and experimented with format in ways that expand the show's universe far beyond Spooner Street. These special episodes reveal the show's creative ambition and willingness to take risks, even if those risks don't always pay off. Understanding Family Guy's multiverse and special episodes means understanding how the show uses these departures from formula to explore different aspects of its characters and push the boundaries of what animated sitcoms can do. The Road to episodes featuring Brian and Stewie have become some of Family Guy's most beloved and ambitious installments. These episodes follow a consistent formula. Brian and Stewie end up in some exotic or dangerous location, face escalating challenges, and ultimately deepen their friendship through shared adversity. But within this formula, the show has explored remarkably diverse settings and storytelling approaches. Road to Rhode Island was the first of these episodes, establishing the template. Stewie travels to California to retrieve his teddy bear Rupert, and Brian accompanies him on a cross-country journey. The episode featured musical numbers, genuine emotion between the characters, and a deeper exploration of their relationship than typical episodes allowed. It revealed Brian's traumatic past and Stewie's capacity for empathy, showing both characters as more complex than their usual comic roles suggested. Road to Europe sent Brian and Stewie across the Atlantic after Stewie's attempt to meet his favorite television show host goes wrong. The European adventure allowed for cultural commentary, fish-out-of-water comedy, and another opportunity for the characters to rely on each other in unfamiliar territory. Each location they visited, from London to Vatican City, provided different challenges and comic opportunities. Road to Rupert returned to the central relationship between Stewie and his teddy bear, while also exploring Brian's terrible financial decisions and gambling addiction. The episode took them to Aspen, where wealthy elites vacation, and Brian's pretensions about fitting into high society were exposed as delusions. Stewie's determination to retrieve Rupert showed his capacity for loyalty and love beneath his genius exterior. Road to Germany represented a dramatic tonal shift, sending Brian and Stewie back in time to Nazi Germany. This episode tackled one of history's darkest periods through the show's irreverent lens, a risky choice that could have failed spectacularly, but largely succeeded through commitment to the premise. Brian and Stewie had to navigate a genuinely evil regime while trying to return to their own time, creating tension and stakes unusual for the show. Road to the Multiverse became perhaps the most ambitious road to episode, sending Brian and Stewie through parallel universes where fundamental aspects of reality were different. They visited a universe where dogs were intelligent and humans were pets, reversing their normal dynamic. They encountered a universe drawn like a Disney animation, complete with musical numbers and cheerful animals. They saw a universe of realistic humans rather than cartoons, rendered in unsettling live action. Each universe explored different animation styles and storytelling possibilities, while examining how small changes in reality could create vastly different worlds. This multiverse episode introduced the concept that infinite parallel universes exist in Family Guy's cosmology, each with variations on the characters and situations we know. Some universes are minor variations, a Quahog where everyone's slightly different but recognizable. Other universes are radically different, worlds where physics works differently, where species evolved along different paths, where fundamental rules of reality diverge from our own. Road to the North Pole took Brian and Stewie to meet Santa Claus, discovering that the jolly gift giver was actually an overworked, broken man struggling to meet impossible demands in an age of global overpopulation and rampant consumerism. The episode was surprisingly dark, showing Santa's workshop as a nightmare of exploitation and Santa himself as barely holding together under the strain. Brian and Stewie's attempt to help ultimately made things worse before they found a solution. Road to Las Vegas saw them traveling to Nevada for what should have been a fun gambling adventure, but turned into a much darker exploration of addiction, desperation, and the ugliness beneath Las Vegas's glamorous surface. The episode didn't pull punches about how gambling destroys lives and how the city's entertainment industry exploits human weakness for profit. The Star Wars parody trilogy represents Family Guy's most extensive special project, recreating the original Star Wars trilogy with Family Guy characters filling the iconic roles. Blue Harvest covered A New Hope, with Peter as Han Solo, Chris as Luke Skywalker, Lois as Leia, and other characters filling out the cast. The parody was remarkably faithful to the source material, while adding Family Guy's signature irreverent humor and cultural commentary. Something, Dark Side tackled The Empire Strikes Back, generally considered the best of the original Star Wars films, and therefore the most challenging to parody effectively. The episode maintained the same character assignments while exploring the darker themes of the middle installment. It showed genuine affection for the source material, even while mocking it. It's a Trap completed the trilogy with Return of the Jedi, though by this point the concept was showing some wear. The novelty had faded, and the episode felt more like obligation than inspiration. Still, it completed the cycle and gave fans a full Family Guy version of the original trilogy, an impressive achievement in sustained parody. These Star Wars episodes revealed the show's ability to sustain extended narratives that departed completely from the normal sitcom format. They required enormous effort in animation, writing, and production to recreate iconic scenes while adding Family Guy's twist. They were passion projects that demonstrated respect for the source material despite the mockery. The show's musical episodes represent another format experiment. Family Guy Presents, Seth and Alex's almost live comedy show, was a live-action/animated hybrid special that pushed boundaries of what the show could do. Other episodes have featured extended musical sequences or built entire plots around songs, exploring the musical talent of the voice cast and the show's ability to tell stories through music. And Then There Were Fewer was a murder mystery special that brought together Family Guy's extensive cast for a weekend at a mansion where someone started killing guests one by one. The episode played the murder mystery genre straight while incorporating the show's humor, creating genuine suspense about who would die next and who the killer would be revealed to be. Diane Simmons' transformation from comic relief character to murderous antagonist shocked viewers and showed the show's willingness to make permanent changes to its universe. The alternate universe. Episodes beyond Road to the Multiverse have explored what-if scenarios and different versions of the characters. Some universes show the Griffins as successful and well-adjusted. Others show them as even more dysfunctional. These glimpses into parallel lives reveal aspects of the characters by showing what they might have been under different circumstances. Time travel episodes have allowed the show to visit different eras and show how the characters interact with historical periods. Brian and Stewie's time travel adventures have taken them to various points in history, sometimes as observers and sometimes as active participants who change events. These episodes play with causality and paradox, sometimes taking temporal mechanics seriously, and sometimes ignoring them completely for comic effect. The show has done anthology episodes where different stories are told within a framing device. Partial Terms of Endearment dealt with controversial subject matter through a story about surrogacy and abortion that some networks refuse to air. Viewer mail episodes respond to supposed letters from viewers with 3 short stories showcasing different concepts. These anthology formats allow experimentation with tone, style, and subject matter that wouldn't work in standard episodes. Holiday specials have become Family Guy traditions, with Christmas, Halloween, and other holidays receiving themed episodes that maintain the show's irreverent approach while engaging with holiday iconography and traditions. These episodes often feature special animation, musical numbers, or format changes that distinguish them from regular installments. Brian and Stewie was a bottle episode featuring only the 2 titular characters trapped in a bank vault, forced to have honest conversations while facing their possible deaths. The episode was remarkably intimate and emotional, stripping away the usual distractions and supporting cast to focus entirely on their relationship. It showed what the show could do when it slowed down and invested in character development, rather than rapid-fire jokes. The show's experimental episodes sometimes fail, pushing too far or trying concepts that don't work with Family Guy's established universe. But the willingness to experiment, to risk failure in pursuit of something different, has kept the show from becoming stale, despite its long run. Not every special episode succeeds, but the attempt to do something new matters. The multiverse concept has implications beyond just the special episodes. It suggests that every character exists in infinite variations across infinite universes. Somewhere, there's a universe where Peter is intelligent and successful. Somewhere, there's a universe where Meg is loved and appreciated. Somewhere, there's a universe where every character's life went differently, where different choices led to different outcomes. This multiplicity means that the Family Guy we watch is just one possibility among infinite alternatives. Understanding these special episodes and multiverse explorations means recognizing them as opportunities for the show to examine its characters and premises from new angles. When Brian and Stewie travel through the multiverse, we learn about them by seeing how they react to radically different realities. When the show parodies Star Wars, we learn about the characters through which roles they fill in the familiar story. When episodes experiment with format, we see what the show's capable of when freed from standard sitcom constraints. These departures from formula also provide relief from the standard episode structure. After watching hundreds of episodes of the Griffins dealing with typical sitcom situations, audiences need something different to maintain interest. The special episodes deliver that novelty while still being recognizably Family Guy, maintaining the show's voice and sensibility while exploring new territory. The legacy of these special episodes is a show that's proven more ambitious and experimental than most animated sitcoms. Family Guy could have coasted on its formula, producing similar episodes indefinitely. Instead, it's consistently tried new things, some successful and some not, but always pushing against the boundaries of what the show could be. This ambition has produced some of the show's best work and worst failures, but it's made Family Guy more interesting than it would have been playing it safe. The multiverse, the special episodes, and the format experiments are proof that even a show about a dysfunctional family in Rhode Island can reach for the stars, travel through time, and explore infinite possibilities while still being fundamentally itself. Family Guy premiered on January 31st, 1999, and over the following 2.5 decades, it transformed from a controversial animated sitcom into a cultural phenomenon that fundamentally changed television comedy, influenced an entire generation's sense of humor, and became one of the longest-running American animated series in television history. Understanding Family Guy's legacy means understanding its impact on comedy, its controversial relationship with boundaries and taste, its resurrection from cancellation, and how it shaped the media landscape for animated adult sitcoms that followed. As we close this comprehensive exploration of Family Guy lore, it's worth examining what this show has meant and continues to mean in the broader context of American popular culture. When Family Guy first aired, it entered a landscape dominated by The Simpsons, which had essentially created the modern animated sitcom genre and set the standard for what these shows could be. Family Guy was clearly influenced by The Simpsons in its basic premise: a dysfunctional family in an American town, satirizing contemporary culture and American life. But Family Guy distinguished itself through its particular brand of humor: faster paced, more reliant on cutaway gags and pop culture references, willing to push boundaries further than The Simpsons typically ventured. The early seasons of Family Guy were marked by this aggressive boundary pushing. The show tackled subjects that mainstream sitcoms avoided: disability, religion, sexuality, death, and politics, all filtered through an irreverent lens that found humor in discomfort. This approach earned the show a devoted following among viewers who appreciated comedy that refused to stay within safe boundaries. But it also generated controversy and criticism from those who felt the show went too far, too often, in pursuit of shock value. The show's cancellation after 3 seasons could have been the end of the story. Fox pulled the plug in 2002, citing low ratings and high production costs. Family Guy joined the graveyard of animated shows that failed to find sustainable audiences. But something unusual happened during the show's hiatus. DVD sales were extraordinary, demonstrating that Family Guy had a fan base far more substantial than its television ratings suggested. Adult Swim began airing reruns that drew impressive viewership. The show found its audience in syndication and home video in ways that television ratings hadn't captured. This groundswell of support led to Family Guy's resurrection in 2005, making it one of the few canceled shows ever brought back due to popular demand. The revival was a major television event, proving that networks couldn't ignore the changing media landscape where DVD sales and cable reruns mattered as much as broadcast ratings. Family Guy's return changed how television executives thought about cancellation decisions and alternative revenue streams. The post-revival seasons saw Family Guy evolve in significant ways. The animation quality improved dramatically, moving from somewhat crude early designs to much more polished and expressive character work. The voice acting became more nuanced as the cast grew into their roles over hundreds of episodes. The writing shifted in focus, with some characters receiving more development and complexity, while others became more one-note and exaggerated. The show's cultural impact has been immense and multifaceted. Family Guy popularized the cutaway gag structure, where the narrative stops completely to show a flashback or fantasy sequence illustrating a joke or reference. This technique was sometimes criticized as lazy writing, a way to tell jokes without integrating them into the story, but it became Family Guy's signature and influenced countless other shows. The rapid-fire pop culture references created a particular kind of comedy that rewarded viewers for catching obscure allusions while remaining funny even for those who missed the references. The show's influence on internet culture and meme creation cannot be overstated. Family Guy clips became early viral videos on YouTube, spreading jokes and scenes to audiences far beyond the show's television viewers. Memes based on Family Guy moments and quotes proliferated across social media platforms. The show's rapid pace and visual comedy translated perfectly to short video clips that could be easily shared and remixed. Phrases like giggity, scenes like Peter fighting the giant chicken, and moments like the extended Conway Twitty performances became cultural touchstones recognized far beyond the show's actual audience. For millennials and Gen Z viewers, Family Guy became formative in shaping their sense of humor. People who grew up watching the show internalized its rhythms, references, and approach to comedy. This generational impact means that Family Guy's influence will persist long after the show eventually ends, carried forward by people whose comedic sensibilities were fundamentally shaped by years of watching the Griffins' adventures. The show's approach to controversial topics has been both its strength and its greatest source of criticism. Family Guy has been accused of racism, sexism, homophobia, transphobia, and general insensitivity toward marginalized groups. The show's defense has typically been that it mocks everyone equally, that no subject is off limits, and that comedy should be free to push boundaries without worrying about offending sensibilities. Critics counter that not all mockery is equal, that punching down at vulnerable groups isn't the same as satirizing the powerful, and that offensive humor needs to have a point beyond just being offensive. This tension between free speech, absolutism in comedy, and responsibility toward marginalized communities has made Family Guy a flashpoint in broader cultural debates about political correctness, cancel culture, and the boundaries of acceptable humor. The show has survived controversies that might have destroyed other programs, partly because its audience values the transgressive elements that critics condemn, and partly because animated shows seem to operate under different rules than live-action programming. The evolution of individual characters over the show's run reflects changing cultural attitudes and the writer's developing understanding of their creation. Stewie's transformation from evil genius, bent on matricide, to complex character struggling with sexuality and identity represents the show's most successful character development. Brian's evolution from voice of reason to exposed pretentious fraud shows the writer's willingness to deconstruct their own characters. Meg's treatment, which started as typical sitcom sibling mockery and evolved into systematic abuse, represents one of the show's more uncomfortable ongoing elements that many viewers find difficult to reconcile with their enjoyment of the show. The show's treatment of LGBTQ characters and themes has been particularly controversial and evolved significantly over its run. Early seasons featured gay characters primarily as punchlines or stereotypes. As cultural attitudes shifted and representation became more important to audiences, the show attempted to include more nuanced portrayals, though it never abandoned its tendency to make sexuality itself a source of humor. Stewie's ambiguous sexuality, Ida Quagmire's transgender identity, and various LGBTQ supporting characters represent the show's attempts to engage with these themes, with mixed success from representation standpoint. The show's longevity, now extending past 400 episodes across more than 20 seasons, is itself a remarkable achievement. Very few animated shows reach this milestone. The Simpsons remains the gold standard with over 700 episodes, but Family Guy's persistence demonstrates genuine staying power and audience loyalty. Maintaining quality and freshness over such a long run is nearly impossible, and Family Guy hasn't always succeeded. Later seasons are generally considered weaker than earlier ones, with jokes feeling more tired, character development stagnating or regressing, and the show occasionally seeming to operate on autopilot. But even when Family Guy isn't at its best, it maintains a baseline competent insolence and occasional flashes of brilliance that keep audiences watching. The show knows what it is and delivers that product consistently. Fans tuning into a new episode know basically what to expect, and the show delivers on those expectations reliably, if not always excitingly. The financial success of Family Guy has been extraordinary. The show has generated billions in revenue through advertising, syndication deals, DVD sales, streaming rights, and merchandise. It spawned a spin-off, The Cleveland Show, which ran for 4 seasons before Cleveland returned to Family Guy. The show made Seth MacFarlane one of the most powerful figures in entertainment, leading to other animated series like American Dad and various non-animated projects. Family Guy became a franchise rather than just a show, expanding into video games, comics, and other media. The voice cast has become intrinsically linked to their characters. Seth MacFarlane voices Peter, Stewie, Brian, Quagmire, and numerous supporting characters, making him the show's most essential element. His ability to perform multiple distinct characters in a single scene showcases remarkable talent. Alex Borstein's Lois, Seth Green's Chris, Mila Kunis's Meg, after replacing Lacey Chabert, and the rest of the cast have inhabited these characters for so long that imagining anyone else in these roles is nearly impossible. The show's relationship with Fox has been complex and occasionally contentious. Fox executives have sometimes pushed back against content they considered too controversial, leading to censorship battles and episodes that aired in modified form or not at all on broadcast television. The show has responded by mocking Fox repeatedly, making the network itself a target of jokes. This willingness to bite the hand that feeds it demonstrates a level of creative independence unusual in television. Family Guy's influence on subsequent animated sitcoms is evident in shows like American Dad, The Cleveland Show, Bordertown, and others that followed the template of family-centered animated comedy with irreverent humor and cutaway gags. Some of these shows succeeded, others failed, but Family Guy's impact on the genre is undeniable. It proved that the Simpsons model could be adapted and modified, that there was room for multiple animated sitcoms in prime time, and that audiences would embrace shows pushing boundaries in ways The Simpsons typically didn't. The show's awards and critical recognition have been substantial, if not overwhelming. Family Guy has won multiple Emmy Awards, particularly for voice acting and individual episodes. It's been nominated for numerous other awards across various categories. Critical reception has been mixed throughout its run, with some critics praising its ambition and humor, while others condemn its reliance on shock value and offensive material. The show has never achieved the universal critical acclaim that The Simpsons enjoyed in its golden age, but it's carved out its own legacy, independent of critical validation. Looking at Family Guy's place in television history, it represents a particular moment in American culture and comedy. It emerged in the late 1990s, when television was still the dominant medium, before streaming services fractured audiences into countless niches. It pushed boundaries in ways that reflected turn-of-the-millennium attitudes about political correctness and offensive humor. It created a template for animated comedy that influenced a generation of shows. It proved that canceled shows could return if the audience demand was strong enough. As we conclude this comprehensive exploration of Family Guy lore, having examined every major character's backstory, the town they inhabit, the conflicts they face, and the multiverse they occasionally explore, several things become clear. Family Guy is more than just a cartoon about a fat man and his family. It's a complex universe with surprising depth, consistent characterization beneath the chaos, and genuine creativity in how it explores its premises. The Griffin family, for all their dysfunction and terrible behavior, represents something recognizably human. Peter's stupidity and insecurity, Lois's frustrated compromise between who she was and who she became, Meg's desperate need for acceptance, Chris's sensitive soul in a world that doesn't value sensitivity, Stewie's brilliant mind seeking connection and understanding, Brian's pretentious mask hiding deep inadequacy. These aren't just cartoon characters. They're exaggerated reflections of real human struggles and failings. Quahog, Rhode Island, despite being fictional, feels like a real place because it's populated by characters with history, institutions that barely function, and a culture that's been built up over hundreds of episodes. The supporting cast, from Mayor West to Quagmire to Joe to Cleveland and beyond, create a rich ecosystem that makes the Griffin family's story feel embedded in a larger community rather than happening in isolation. The show's willingness to experiment, to try new formats, and explore alternate universes demonstrates creative ambition beyond what most sitcoms attempt. The road to episodes, the Star Wars parodies, the musical numbers, And the format experiments show a creative team that refuses to simply coast on formula even after hundreds of episodes. Family Guy's legacy is complicated, as perhaps it should be for a show that's always been controversial and divisive. It changed television comedy in ways both positive and negative. It influenced how an entire generation thinks about humor and what's acceptable to joke about. It proved that animation wasn't just for children, and that adult animated sitcoms could address mature themes while remaining fundamentally cartoonish. It demonstrated the power of fan support in an era of changing media consumption patterns. Whether Family Guy is ultimately good or bad for culture, whether its boundary-pushing represents courageous comedy or irresponsible offense, whether its influence will be remembered fondly or critically reassessed by future generations, these questions remain open and probably can't be definitively answered. What's certain is that Family Guy matters, that it's had impact far beyond what its creators probably imagined when they first pitched a show about a man and his talking dog, and that it's earned its place in television history. As you drift off to sleep, hopefully having absorbed this comprehensive journey through Family Guy's lore, characters, and universe, remember that this show about a dysfunctional family in Rhode Island has touched millions of lives, created countless memories, and become part of the cultural fabric of early 21st century America. Whether you're a devoted fan who's watched every episode multiple times, or a casual viewer who occasionally catches an episode, Family Guy has probably influenced your sense of humor and your understanding of what television comedy can be. And with that, we've reached the end of our journey through the complete lore of Family Guy. Every major character has been examined, every important relationship explored, every significant location mapped, and every influential element analyzed. From Peter's Mexican birth to Stewie's time travel adventures, from Lois's aristocratic upbringing to Meg's systematic abuse, from Brian's failed writing career to Quagmire's disturbing predation, from Joe's paralysis to Cleveland's patient friendship, from Quahog's dysfunctional institutions to the multiverse's infinite variations, we've covered the comprehensive history and backstory of this animated universe. Thank you for spending these hours exploring Family Guy with us. If you enjoyed this deep dive into animated sitcom lore, make sure you're subscribed to the channel for more comprehensive explorations of the shows, movies, and universes you love. Sweet dreams, and may your sleep be filled with the kind of absurd adventures that only Family Guy could provide.